There are places on this earth where the past speaks with a voice so clear you can almost hear it on the wind. Stand in the mountains of ancient Japan, among the cryptomeria trees that have witnessed 1,000 years, and you might sense what our story is about to reveal. This is not merely a tale of warriors, it is something far more profound, a chronicle of how human beings, bound to the land and to each other, created a culture that would echo through the centuries. Before there were samurai, there was the land itself. The Japanese archipelago, a chain of islands stretching like a dragon's spine through the western Pacific, has always been a realm of contrasts. Volcanic mountains rise sharply from narrow coastal plains. Hot springs bubble up from the earth's restless interior. Typhoons sweep in with terrible fury, and earthquakes remind every generation that the ground beneath their feet is alive. In such a landscape, the people who settled here 8,000 years ago learned a fundamental truth. Nature is not something to conquer. It is something to live with, to respect, to honor. This relationship with the natural world gave birth to Shinto, the way of the kami. Imagine, if you will, a belief system where divinity resides not in distant heavens, but in the waterfall near your village, in the ancient tree at the crossroads, in the mountain that dominates your horizon. The kami are everywhere, spirits of place, of ancestors, of the forces that shape existence itself. This was Japan's first religion, and it remains woven into the fabric of Japanese life even today. By the 8th century after the Common Era, something remarkable was taking shape. The imperial court, having moved to a new capital called Heian-kyo, the city we now know as Kyoto, was creating one of the most refined and sophisticated cultures the world had ever seen. Picture the nobility in their layered silk robes, the colors chosen to echo the seasons. Imagine poetry competitions where a single poorly chosen word could damage one's reputation for years. This was a civilization that found profound meaning in the placement of a flower, in the precise moment when cherry blossoms reach their peak before falling. But here is what makes this story fascinating. While courtiers in Kyoto were perfecting the art of living beautifully, something entirely different was happening in the provinces. Beyond the capital's elegant precincts, Japan was a patchwork of clan territories. These clans extended families bound by blood, marriage, and mutual obligation controlled the land. And land, in an agricultural society, was everything. Rice paddies required constant maintenance. Irrigation systems demanded cooperation. Borders needed defending. The great aristocratic families of Kyoto might claim authority, but in the countryside, real power belonged to those who could organize labor, manage resources, and when necessary, fight. The fighting men of these clans were called many things in those early days: bushi, tsuwamono, warriors, but gradually a particular term began to dominate: samurai. It comes from the verb saburao, which means to serve, to attend upon someone of higher rank. From the beginning, then, the samurai identity was defined not by violence but by loyalty, by the sacred bond between protector and protected. Consider for a moment what it meant to be a provincial warrior in the 9th or 10th century. Your home was not a castle, those would come later, but a fortified compound, part residence and part garrison. Wooden walls enclosed several buildings: the main hall where your family lived, storehouses for rice and weapons, quarters for retainers and servants, perhaps a small shrine where you honored your ancestors and the local kami. Outside, the rice fields stretched to the horizon, worked by farmers who looked to you for protection and justice. Your day began before dawn. In the darkness, you might light a stick of incense at the family altar, bow before the memorial tablets of your father and grandfather, feel their presence in the shadows. The weight of inheritance pressed upon you not just land and position, but duty. Your ancestors had held these fields. Your children would hold them after you. You were a link in an unbreakable chain. As light crept across the mountains, you would practice. The bow was your primary weapon, And archery was not merely a martial skill but a spiritual discipline. To draw a bow properly required years of training, perfect balance, absolute focus. You wore the armor your family could afford, perhaps leather plates lacquered and laced together, or if your clan was wealthy, the iron scales that would become the signature of samurai protection. The armor was heavy, restrictive, but you had learned to move in it as naturally as in ordinary clothes. Your horse, that was another matter entirely. The relationship between a warrior and his mount was sacred. These were not the great war horses of European knights, but smaller, more agile creatures bred for mountain terrain. You had trained your horse since it was young, and it knew your voice, your touch, the subtle shifts of weight that guided it in combat. On horseback, drawing your bow at full gallop, you became something more than human, a fusion of rider and animal, power and precision. But warfare, in those days, was not constant. Months might pass, even years, without serious conflict. You spent your time managing your estate, settling disputes among the farmers, collecting the rice that was not just food, but currency. You practiced calligraphy, because even a provincial warrior was expected to compose poetry, to appreciate beauty. You studied the Chinese classics, learning the Confucian principles of loyalty, filial piety, and righteous governance that would shape samurai philosophy for centuries to come. And when your lord called you to serve at court, you went. You attended upon him, demonstrated your skills, performed guard duty. You served that fundamental meaning of samurai, and in serving, you earned the rice stipends that supported your family and retainers. Now, transport yourself to the capital itself, to Heian-kyo in its glory. What a contrast! The city was laid out in a perfect grid, modelled after the great Chinese capital of Chang'an. Wide avenues ran north to south, east to west, dividing the city into symmetrical blocks. The imperial palace complex dominated the northern sector, vermilion pillars, tiled roofs of green and gold, gardens designed to evoke the paradise of Buddhist cosmology. The aristocracy who lived here had perfected an aesthetic so refined it seems almost unreal. Their lives revolved around poetry, music, elaborate ceremonies, and above all, mono-no-aware, a sensitivity to the transience of all things. They understood, with a clarity that pervades their literature, that beauty is inseparable from impermanence. The cherry blossom is exquisite precisely because it falls. The full moon is precious because it wanes. Women of the court held remarkable cultural power. This was the age that produced The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, a novel of such psychological depth and literary sophistication that it astonishes modern readers. Court ladies kept diaries that reveal inner lives of startling complexity. They were educated, politically astute, and central to the cultural achievements of the age. Yet even in this refined world, warriors were present. The great aristocratic families, the Fujiwara, the Taira, the Minamoto, all maintained private military forces. When disputes arose that poetry could not settle, when rivalries turned violent, they called upon their samurai retainers. The warriors who came to the capital from the provinces must have seemed exotic, even crude, to sophisticated courtiers. But they were also fascinating, dangerous, and increasingly necessary, because the elegant world of Heian was built on foundations that were crumbling. The imperial government's authority over the provinces had always been more theoretical than real. As the centuries progressed, it grew weaker still. Local strongmen ignored directives from the capital. Monasteries, yes, Buddhist monasteries raised their own armies of warrior monks, the Sohei, who would descend on Kyoto to enforce their demands through intimidation and violence. Banditry increased. Pirates raided the coasts. The court needed protection, and increasingly they relied on the very warrior clans whose growing power would eventually displace them. Two clans in particular rose to prominence: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both claimed descent from imperial princes who had been given family names and sent to the provinces, a common practice when the capital could not support too many royal offspring. Over generations, these families had become warriors, their members proving themselves in campaigns against rebellions and border incursions. By the middle of the 12th century, they had become indispensable to competing factions within the court itself. What happened next would transform Japan forever. In 1156, a dispute over imperial succession erupted into violence. The Hogan Rebellion, it was called, and it marked the first time in 3 centuries that open warfare occurred in the capital itself. Both the Taira and Minamoto split internally, with different branches supporting different claimants. When the fighting ended after just 2 days, something fundamental had changed. The imperial court had demonstrated that it could no longer maintain order without warrior power. 3 years later came the Heiji Rebellion. Again, factional dispute. Again, the Taira and Minamoto on opposing sides. This time, the Taira clan, led by the brilliant Taira no Kiyomori, emerged victorious. Their Minamoto rivals were crushed. The clan leader was executed. His sons were hunted down, most were killed, but a few young boys were spared and sent to monasteries, too insignificant to threaten Taira dominance, or so it seemed. Taira no Kiyomori became, in effect, the power behind the throne. He married his daughter to the emperor. He accumulated positions, titles, wealth beyond measure. He moved the capital to Fukuhara, near modern Kobe, though this lasted only 6 months before protests forced a return to Kyoto. The Taira clan controlled Japan, and Kiyomori enjoyed the kind of authority no warrior had ever possessed. But the old Heian aristocrats whispered their resentment. The surviving Minamoto sons had grown to manhood in exile, burning with desire for revenge, and most importantly, the provincial warrior clans who had once served the terror began to question why they should obey a family that had become, in essence, court aristocrats themselves, warriors who had forgotten their roots. In 1180, Kiyomori died. Within a few years, rebellion erupted. The Genpei War, named for the Sino-Japanese pronunciations of the Minamoto clan and Taira Hei clan names, would rage for 5 years, from 1180 to 1185. It was a conflict that scarred the entire nation, a war of annihilation that would be remembered in poetry, drama, and legend for centuries to come. This was where the samurai truly emerged as a distinct social class, where the warrior ethos crystallized into something recognizable across the generations. Among the warriors who fought in this conflict was a woman who deserves our attention, Tomoe Gozen. The historical record for women warriors is sparse. Patriarchal societies rarely document women's military achievements, but Tomoe's prowess was so remarkable that even male chroniclers could not ignore her. She served Minamoto no Yoshinaka, one of the Minamoto clan leaders, and was described as exceptionally strong, a magnificent rider, and a warrior equal to 1,000 ordinary men. She fought in the desperate Battle of Owazu, taking heads in single combat, before finally being ordered to flee by Yoshinaka, who wanted her to survive the certain death he faced. Her story reminds us that the warrior tradition, while predominantly male, was never exclusively so. The Genpei War culminated at sea, in the Straits of Danura. There, in 1185, the Minamoto fleet cornered the Taira forces. When defeat became inevitable, rather than surrender, the Taira chose death. Warriors threw themselves into the waves. Taira women clutched their children and jumped from the ships. The child emperor Antoku, barely 7 years old, was carried into the water by his grandmother, who told him they were going to a wonderful palace beneath the sea. The sacred imperial regalia, the sword, the jewel, the mirror, went down with them. It was total victory for the Minamoto, and it was the end of an age. The man who emerged as the ultimate victor was Minamoto no Yoritomo. He was a survivor, one of those young boys spared after the Heiji Rebellion, who had spent 20 years in exile, waiting, planning. He was also a political genius. Rather than settling in Kyoto, where the old court culture might dilute warrior values, he established his headquarters in Kamakura, a small coastal town far to the east. There, surrounded by mountains and sea, protected by geography and the loyalty of his retainers, he created something new, a warrior government separate from, but theoretically subordinate to the imperial court. In 1192, the emperor granted Yoritomo the title of Shogun Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo. It was an old military rank, but Yoritomo transformed it into something permanent, hereditary military dictatorship. For the next 676 years, until 1868, Japan would be ruled by shoguns, while emperors reigned in Kyoto as sacred but politically powerless figures. This was the birth of samurai dominance. These warriors, who had emerged from provincial obscurity as clan protectors, now ruled the nation. But what exactly did it mean to be samurai in this new age? What values would define them? What code would govern their conduct? The answers would develop over the coming centuries, but the foundation was being laid. Loyalty above all, loyalty to one's lord, sealed by mutual obligation. Martial skill as constant practice, not merely for war but for spiritual cultivation. A deep connection to the land, to ancestors, to the invisible threads that bound past, present, and future. An acceptance of death as the price of honor, as natural as the falling of cherry blossoms. Stand again in those mountains where we began, among the ancient trees. Listen to the wind. The samurai were not separate from this landscape. They were expressions of it, products of islands where nature's power was always evident, where communities survived through cooperation and hierarchy, where beauty and violence were equally real, equally present in daily existence. What came next? The centuries of development, conflict, transformation, and ultimately transcendence would build upon these foundations. The warrior culture of Japan would become something unique in human history, a fusion of martial prowess and artistic refinement, of brutality and beauty, of rigid hierarchy and profound philosophy. But that is a story for what comes next. For now, we leave the 12th century behind, standing at the threshold of the age when samurai would truly define Japan. The roots are in place, deep in sacred earth. Now watch what grows from them. There is a particular quality to dawn in Kamakura. The light comes slowly, filtered through coastal mist, touching first the peaks of the mountains that embrace this warrior capital. In the early 13th century, as a samurai rose to face the new day, he was not merely preparing for the possibility of combat. He was engaging in a ritual that defined his very existence, a daily recommitment to a way of life that demanded everything and promised, in return, meaning. Let us step into that world. Let us understand how these warriors actually lived. The samurai's home in Kamakura was modest by the standards of Kyoto aristocracy, but it possessed its own austere dignity. Built of wood and paper, with sliding screens that could reconfigure space as needed, it was designed for both comfort and defense. The entrance faced the road, but a second exit led to the stables, because a warrior's relationship with his horse was so fundamental that man and mount should never be far apart. In the garden, deliberately simple, stones arranged just so, created the suggestion of mountains and rivers. This was not decoration. It was philosophy, made visible, nature distilled to its essence. The day began in darkness. Before the household stirred, the warrior would rise and make his way to the family shrine. There, by candlelight, he would kneel before the memorial tablets of his ancestors. The incense smoke curled upward, carrying prayers to those who came before. This was not superstition. This was recognition of something profound, that he existed as part of an unbroken lineage, that his actions would either honor or shame not just himself, but generations past and generations yet unborn. After this moment of connection with eternity, the immediate present demanded attention. Physical training was not optional. It was the foundation of samurai identity. In the courtyard, as the sky began to lighten, he would practice with the bow. The Japanese longbow, the yumi, is one of the most distinctive weapons ever created. Asymmetrical, with the grip positioned not at the center, but a third of the way up from the base, it requires years to master. Made from laminated bamboo and wood, it stands taller than a man. To draw it properly, you must engage your entire body, legs, core, shoulders, arms, moving in perfect harmony. The release, when it comes, should be so natural that you barely feel it. The arrow flies, not because you force it, but because you have created the conditions for its inevitable flight. This was Kyudo, the way of the bow. And notice that word, way. Not technique, not skill, but way. A path, a discipline that shapes the person who practices it. Stand in the correct stance, breathe properly, focus absolutely, and something happens. The barrier between self and action dissolves. You do not shoot the arrow shoots itself. This is what the warriors were discovering, guided by Zen teachers who were arriving from China with radical new approaches to Buddhist practice. Zen Buddhism had reached Japan in earlier centuries, but it was during the Kamakura period that it truly took root among the warrior class. Why? Because Zen offered something that the elaborate rituals and scholarly theology of established Buddhism did not: a direct, immediate path to enlightenment through meditation and intuitive understanding. Sit, breathe. Watch your thoughts arise and dissolve. Do this with absolute commitment, and you might break through to a direct experience of reality unfiltered by conceptual thinking. For warriors who lived with the constant possibility of death, this was transformative. Zen taught that life and death were not opposites, but part of a unified whole. Fear of death came from attachment to the illusory self. Dissolve that attachment through meditation, and you could face combat with a clear mind, acting with spontaneous perfection, because you were not trapped in self-conscious thought. The great Zen master Eisai, who had studied in China and returned to Japan in the late 12th century, established temples in Kamakura with direct shogunal patronage. Warriors flocked to study with Zen teachers, seeking not religious salvation in the conventional sense, but practical wisdom for living fully in each moment. They learned Zazen-seated meditation. They grappled with Koen's paradoxical questions designed to short-circuit logical thinking, provoke sudden insight, and they discovered that the focus required for meditation was the same focus required for archery, for swordsmanship, for every aspect of warrior discipline. After morning practice, our samurai would return to his home for the morning meal. Rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup, perhaps fish if the catch had been good. His wife would have overseen the preparation, managing the household with the same administrative skill that he brought to his duties as a retainer. And here we must pause to consider the women who made samurai life possible. Samurai marriages were alliances. A man's wife typically came from another warrior family, bringing with her a dowry and, more importantly, strengthening the web of obligations that held the samurai class together. These were not love matches in the romantic sense, though affection certainly could and did develop. They were partnerships founded on mutual duty and respect. A samurai wife managed a complex household. She oversaw servants, maintained accounts, ensured that rice stores would last through winter, supervised the education of daughters, and prepared sons for their future as warriors. She was expected to embody feminine virtues, grace, obedience, and devotion. But within the domestic sphere, she held considerable authority. And when necessity demanded, She was prepared to defend that sphere with her life. Women of the samurai class were trained in the use of the naginata, a pole weapon with a curved blade, ideal for defensive combat. Should enemies breach the walls while the men were away, the women would fight. They were taught that their honor was as important as any man's, that death was preferable to capture, that the family name must be protected regardless of the cost. There are documented cases throughout samurai history of women defending their homes with ferocious skill, of mothers choosing to kill their children rather than let them fall into enemy hands, of daughters committing suicide to preserve family honor when their fathers were defeated. This was the reality behind the aesthetic beauty, a world where duty often demanded terrible choices, where love was secondary to loyalty, where personal desire was subordinate to collective obligation. After the morning meal, our samurai would attend to his primary duty, service to his lord. The Kamakura Bakufu, the warrior government, was organized on principles of mutual obligation that ran vertically through society. At the top sat the shogun. Below him were his direct retainers, the gokunin. These men held land grants and in return provided military service, guard duty, and administrative support. They, in turn, had their own retainers, creating a pyramid of loyalty and obligation that structured the entire warrior class. Service might take many forms: guard duty at the shogun's residence, rotating in shifts measured by the burning of incense sticks; administrative work, settling land disputes or collecting taxes; training exercises with other retainers, practicing mounted archery or mock combat, or simply being present, demonstrating loyalty through attendance, because in a culture built on personal relationships, visibility mattered. The afternoon might bring a different kind of practice. While the bow remained the primary weapon, the sword was gaining symbolic importance. The tachi, a long, curved blade worn edge down from the belt, was a work of art as much as a weapon. Japanese swordsmiths had developed metallurgical techniques that produced blades of extraordinary quality, combining hard steel for the cutting edge with softer steel for the spine, creating swords that could hold a razor edge yet flex without breaking. The reverence for swords was already developing into something almost religious. A blade was not merely a tool, it was an extension of the warrior's soul. The process of forging a sword involved Shinto purification rituals. The swordsmith worked in a state of ritual cleanliness, making offerings to the kami before beginning. When a master created a truly exceptional blade, it was believed to contain a spirit of its own. Sword practice in this era was different from what would come later. There were no formalized kata sequences of movements to be repeated endlessly. Instead, warriors trained by striking targets, by practicing draws and cuts, by sparring with wooden weapons. The techniques were functional, often brutal. This was not yet the refined art of later centuries. It was combat training, pure and direct. Yet even here, philosophy was creeping in. The idea that technical mastery alone was insufficient, that true skill required spiritual cultivation, mental discipline, the integration of body and mind into seamless unity. The seeds of what would later be called Bushido, the way of the warrior, were germinating in the daily practices of these Kamakura samurai. Evening brought a different kind of discipline. In his home, by lamplight, our warrior would practice calligraphy. This might seem odd. Why should a fighting man concern himself with beautiful writing? But consider what calligraphy demands: perfect control of the brush, absolute focus, aesthetic sensitivity. A single stroke reveals the writer's state of mind. Hesitation, aggression, serenity, all become visible in the flow of ink on paper. More than technique, calligraphy was a way of cultivating the self. The warrior who could compose his mind sufficiently to create beautiful characters was developing the same mental discipline required for combat. And the content of what he wrote mattered too. Copying Buddhist sutras was a form of meditation. Composing or transcribing poetry connected him to the broader cultural tradition that defined civilized life. Because here is something crucial to understand. Samurai were never merely fighters. From the beginning, they were expected to embody both bu and bun martial prowess and cultural refinement. A warrior who could only fight was considered crude, incomplete. True excellence required the ability to compose poetry appropriate to the season, to appreciate the subtleties of a tea ceremony, to understand Chinese classics and Buddhist philosophy. This expectation would only intensify over the centuries, but it was already present in Kamakura. Warriors read the Chinese military classics. Sun Tzu's Art of War was well known, along with other strategic texts. They studied Confucian philosophy, learning the hierarchical relationships that should govern society. Ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger, friend and friend. Each relationship carried specific obligations. To fulfill these obligations perfectly was to achieve moral excellence. Some evenings, our samurai might attend a poetry gathering. Warriors would compose linked verse, each person adding a stanza that connected to but also departed from what came before. This was not frivolous entertainment. It was social bonding, cultural participation, and mental discipline all at once. A warrior who could produce a clever verse, referencing an obscure classical allusion, earned respect. He demonstrated that he was not just a tool of violence, but a complete human being, connected to the cultural heritage that gave life meaning. And sometimes, in quiet moments, he would contemplate death. The awareness of mortality pervaded samurai consciousness. They lived in a world where combat could erupt suddenly, where a lord's command might require sacrifice, where disease and accident claimed lives without warning. Rather than denying this reality, samurai culture embraced it. They wrote poems anticipating their own deaths, imagining the circumstances, preparing themselves mentally for the inevitable moment. There is a famous verse, attributed to many different warriors across the centuries. Like cherry blossoms in the spring, wind so brief and scattered is our human life. How should one spend it? This was not morbid. It was clarifying. If life is brief, how will you live it? If death can come at any moment, what matters? The answer that emerged was loyalty, honor, duty, excellence in all things. Live so that when death arrives, you can meet it without regret, knowing you fulfilled your obligations, maintained your honor, and embodied the values your ancestors passed down. Young warriors were educated in these principles from childhood. A boy born into a samurai family began his training around age 5 or 6. He learned to ride, to draw a bow proportioned to his strength, to swing a wooden sword, but more than technique, he absorbed values. His mother taught him about honor, about the family's history and reputation. His father demonstrated through example what it meant to serve loyally. Stories of famous warriors, their heroic deeds and glorious deaths filled his imagination. At around age 13 or 14 came the coming-of-age ceremony, Genpuku. The boy would have his forelocks cut, receive adult clothing, and take a new name. From this moment, he was a warrior. He could be called upon to fight. His actions reflected on his family. The transition was stark, immediate. Childhood ended. Adult responsibility began. For daughters, the path was different but equally defined. They learned the domestic arts, how to manage a household, to sew and weave, to prepare food. They learned the naginata for self-defense. They were educated in literature and poetry, because a samurai wife was expected to have cultural refinement. And they learned, above all, the virtue of endurance, the strength to support their husbands, to raise sons who would be brave, to face hardship without complaint. Many samurai marriages were arranged when the bride and groom were still children. The political and economic benefits to both families were carefully calculated. When the time came for the wedding, the couple might barely know each other. Yet from this pragmatic foundation, strong partnerships often developed. They faced life's challenges together, bound by duty, but often finding affection in shared struggle. The birth of a son was cause for celebration, an heir to continue the family line, a future warrior to serve the Lord. The birth of a daughter was also valued, for she could be married to form alliances with other families. But infant mortality was high. Disease claimed many children before they reached adulthood. Parents learned not to become too attached too quickly, another aspect of accepting impermanence. Now consider the armor these warriors wore. It was not like European plate armor, solid metal shaped to the body. Japanese armor consisted of thousands of small iron or leather scales, lacquered and laced together with colorful silk cords. Each suit was custom made for its wearer, shaped to allow the movement required for archery on horseback. The helmet kabuto was a work of art, often adorned with crests and decorations that identified the wearer from a distance. Creating a suit of armor required months of work by skilled craftsmen. The lacquering alone involved multiple layers, each requiring time to dry and cure. The lacing, the odoshi, used specific patterns and colors that carried meaning. A warrior might choose colors associated with his family or that he believed would bring good fortune. The result was armor that was simultaneously functional protection and aesthetic expression war gear as wearable art. Maintaining armor was a constant task. The lacquer needed to be checked for cracks. The silk cords could rot if not properly dried after rain or combat. Metal components required oiling to prevent rust. This maintenance was not delegated to servants. The warrior himself cared for his armor because it was too important, too personal to trust to others. In handling each component, inspecting every lace, he built intimacy with the equipment that might save his life. The same was true for his weapons. Bow, arrows, sword each required regular attention. Bowstrings needed replacement. Arrows had to be fletched, straightened, inspected for damage. The sword, especially, demanded careful maintenance. After each use, the blade was cleaned with rice paper to remove any moisture or debris, then a thin film of oil applied to prevent rust. The wooden scabbard was checked for cracks. The sword fittings guard, handle wrapping, ornamental elements were examined and repaired as needed. In all of this, we see a pattern. The samurai's life was structured by rituals of care and attention. Whether maintaining weapons, practicing arts, or performing religious devotions, the day was filled with activities that required focus and discipline. This was not accidental. It was cultivated deliberately, because the samurai were learning that how you do anything is how you do everything. The warrior who was careless in maintaining his equipment would be careless in combat. The warrior who rushed through calligraphy practice would lack the patience required for waiting in ambush. Excellence in all things, this was becoming the standard. And excellence required teachers. The relationship between master and student was another of those fundamental bonds that structured samurai society. A young warrior would be apprenticed to an older, more experienced fighter who would teach not just techniques, but the entire way of life. The student owed absolute obedience and respect. The teacher bore responsibility for the student's development. This relationship often lasted for life, the student remaining loyal to his teacher's memory even after death. In the temples, too, young warriors studied. Zen monasteries became finishing schools for samurai, where they learned meditation, studied Buddhist texts, and absorbed the mental disciplines that would serve them in all aspects of life. The monks who taught them were often warriors themselves in earlier life, men who had taken religious vows after combat careers. They understood what their students would face. Their teaching was practical, direct, stripping away illusion. One practice that was beginning to develop in this period would become central to samurai culture: the tea ceremony. In its early form, it was simple monks drank tea to stay awake during long meditation sessions. But gradually, the preparation and consumption of tea became ritualized. Each movement had purpose. The utensils were carefully chosen. The space where tea was served became a sanctuary from the outside world. The tea ceremony was egalitarian in a remarkable way. Inside the tea room, social hierarchy dissolved. Warrior and merchant, master and student, all were equal participants in a shared aesthetic experience. The ceremony emphasized simplicity, quiet appreciation, mindfulness of the present moment. For warriors accustomed to violence and competition, the tea room offered something precious, a space for peace, for contemplation, for connection with others on a purely human level. Sen no Rikyu, who would later perfect the tea ceremony into its ultimate form, was still centuries in the future. But the foundations were being laid in these Kamakura days, as warriors discovered that the simplest actions, preparing tea, arranging flowers, appreciating an asymmetrical ceramic bowl, could be gateways to profound experience. As night fell, our samurai would return to his family. Perhaps he would tell stories to his children, tales of heroic ancestors, legends of famous battles, moral lessons disguised as entertainment. His wife might play the koto, a stringed instrument whose melancholy tones seemed to capture something essential about the transience of all things. In winter, they would gather around the airori, the square hearth sunk into the floor, sharing warmth and conversation. Before sleep, one final ritual, a return to the family shrine, a moment of gratitude for surviving another day, a prayer for strength to face whatever tomorrow might bring. And then, finally, rest. Lying on a futon spread directly on the tatami mats, head on a wooden pillow designed to preserve the elaborate hairstyle warriors wore, our samurai would surrender to sleep. But even in sleep, readiness remained. His sword was always within reach. His armor stood nearby, ready to be donned at a moment's notice. Because in this era of warrior rule, peace was always temporary. Threats could emerge without warning: bandits, rival clans, pirates raiding the coast, or simple natural disasters requiring organized response. The Kamakura period would last until 1333, more than a century of relative stability under warrior rule. But relative is the key word. There were rebellions, succession disputes, the invasion attempts by Mongol forces in 1274 and 1281 that nearly conquered Japan before providential typhoons, the kamikaze, divine winds, destroyed the invasion fleets. Through it all, the samurai way of life continued to develop, values crystallizing, practices becoming traditions. This was when the foundation was truly laid. The Kamakura warriors, living their disciplined lives of service and cultivation, created a template that would endure. They demonstrated that warriors could be more than destroyers. They could be builders, administrators, patrons of culture, seekers of wisdom. They showed that the same focus required for combat could be applied to art, to philosophy, to spiritual development. And they learned something else, something that would echo through all the centuries to come, that the greatest battle is always internal. The enemy is not the opponent before you, but the fear, doubt, and self-concern within. Conquer yourself, and external enemies become manageable. Fail to master yourself, and no amount of technical skill will save you. The sun rises on another day in Kamakura. Our warrior rises with it, beginning again the cycle of practice, service, cultivation. This is his life, not a series of dramatic moments, but a sustained commitment to a demanding ideal. In the repetition, in the discipline, in the constant striving for excellence, meaning emerges. Purpose becomes clear. This is the way of the bow and horse. This is the warrior's path, and it is just beginning to reveal its deepest possibilities. There are periods in history when the old order collapses so completely that something entirely new becomes possible. Japan, in the late 15th century was such a time. The carefully structured world of warrior loyalty and service that had defined the Kamakura period, that elegant system of obligation and hierarchy, was disintegrating. What emerged from the chaos was extraordinary. A century and a half of nearly continuous warfare that would, paradoxically, produce some of the greatest cultural achievements in Japanese history. The Onin War began in 1467 over a dispute that seems almost trivial in retrospect, a succession question within the Ashikaga shogunate. But beneath this immediate cause lay deep tensions. The shogun's power had been declining for decades. Provincial warriors who had once served obediently were now asserting independence. In Kyoto itself, rival factions gathered armies. When fighting finally erupted, it consumed the capital in flames. Imagine the city that had been the heart of Japanese culture for 7 centuries burning. Temples reduced to ash, palaces abandoned. The emperor, sacred but powerless, maintained his dignity in reduced circumstances while armies fought in the streets outside. The war dragged on for 11 years, and when it finally ended in 1477 there was no clear victor, only exhaustion and ruins. But something had been unleashed that could not be contained. Warriors throughout Japan saw that the shogun could not maintain order, that loyalty to distant authority meant nothing when survival was at stake. Provincial lords, the daimyo, began seizing power in their regions, overthrowing their former masters, claiming independence. This was Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high, a complete inversion of the social order. The period that followed would be called Sengoku, the Age of Warring States. For 150 years, from the mid-15th century until the early 17th, Japan fragmented into dozens of independent domains, each ruled by a daimyo who built castles, raised armies, and fought for survival and expansion. It was brutal, chaotic, and absolutely transformative. Consider what this meant for the individual warrior. In the Kamakura period, a samurai's identity was bound to his lord through hereditary ties that stretched back generations. But in the Sengoku period, lords rose and fell with startling speed. A warrior might serve 3 different masters in his lifetime, not through disloyalty, but through the simple fact that his lord was defeated, killed, or destroyed. Adaptability became as important as loyalty. Competence mattered more than lineage. This was the age of the castle, not the simple fortified compounds of earlier centuries, but massive stone fortifications that dominated landscapes. The technology had evolved dramatically. Daimyo learned to build on hills and mountains, using the natural terrain as part of their defences. They quarried enormous stones and fitted them together with precision that required no mortar. They built walls at angles that made climbing impossible, created killing fields where attackers would be exposed to arrow and gunfire from multiple directions. Inside these castles, small towns developed. The daimyo's retainers lived in compounds arranged by rank. Merchants and artisans settled in designated quarters, providing the goods and services the military class required. Temples offered spiritual solace. The castle town Jokamachi became the basic unit of Sengoku society, a fortified community organized entirely around the needs of warfare. Each region developed its own character. In the mountainous interior, castles perched on peaks connected by treacherous mountain paths. Along the coasts, fortifications had to defend against both land and sea attacks. In the fertile plains, domains competed for control of rice-producing regions. Because rice was wealth, rice was power. The daimyo, who controlled the best agricultural land, could support the largest armies. Some of these daimyo were extraordinary individuals. Takeda Shingen, ruling from his domain in Kai province, was known not just as a brilliant general but as a philosopher-warrior who applied Sun Tzu's principles with devastating effectiveness. His cavalry charges were legendary. His rivalry with Uesugi Kenshin, daimyo of Echigo province, produced some of the most celebrated battles of the era confrontations, where both sides recognized the other's excellence even as they fought to the death. Uesugi Kenshin himself was a fascinating figure, a devout Buddhist who fasted before battles, who claimed to fight not for territorial gain but for righteous causes, who never married and may have been one of those rare warriors who truly transcended worldly ambition. The battles between Takeda and Uesugi at Kawanakajima, fought 5 times between 1553 and 1564, became the stuff of legend, analyzed by military historians, dramatized in plays, remembered as examples of warfare elevated to an art form. In the West, the Mori clan built a naval empire, controlling sea routes and island fortresses. They understood that in a nation of islands, maritime power was crucial. Their ships dominated the inland sea, collecting tolls, preventing enemy movements, projecting force across distances that land armies could not match. And in the south, on the island of Kyushu, something unprecedented was happening. European ships had arrived. In 1543, a Chinese junk carrying Portuguese traders was blown off course and landed on Tanegashima, a small island south of Kyushu. The Portuguese carried something that would transform Japanese warfare: firearms. The Japanese saw these weapons, arquebuses, matchlock guns, demonstrated and immediately grasped their significance. Within months, the island's swordsmiths were producing copies. Within years, Japanese gunsmiths were making firearms that rivaled or exceeded European quality. The introduction of guns changed everything. A peasant with a musket and a few weeks' training could kill a mounted samurai who had trained since childhood. The traditional dominance of the warrior class, built on years of cultivating skill with bow and sword, was suddenly threatened. Some samurai rejected firearms as dishonorable, as weapons that destroyed the meaning of individual excellence, but the smart daimyo understood. This was adaptation or death. Oda Nobunaga understood. He was perhaps the most revolutionary figure of the entire Sengoku period, a daimyo from Owari province who would nearly unite Japan through a combination of military genius, political ruthlessness, and cultural sophistication that still astonishes historians. Nobunaga embraced firearms enthusiastically. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he deployed 3,000 arquebusiers behind wooden palisades, firing in rotating volleys that cut down the legendary Takeda cavalry in wave after wave of relentless gunfire. It was a massacre, and it announced that a new era had arrived. But Nobunaga was not merely a destroyer of tradition. He was a patron of the arts on a scale that rivaled any emperor. He recognized talent and promoted based on ability rather than birth, a radical notion in hierarchical Japan. He invited missionaries and merchants, fascinated by the outside world in a way that was rare among Japanese leaders, and he understood the power of culture as political statement. The tea ceremony reached new heights under Nobunaga's patronage. He recognized that Sen no Rikyu, a merchant's son from Sakai, was creating something profound with his radical simplification of tea practice. Rikyu's vision was revolutionary: ultimate refinement through ultimate simplicity. The tea room should be small, austere, natural. The utensils should appear rough, asymmetrical, imperfect. Beauty emerged not from obvious display but from wabi-sabi, the aesthetic of the weathered, the humble, the understated. Nobunaga hosted tea ceremonies as political events. An invitation to take tea with him was a signal of favor. The right to own certain famous tea implements became a reward for loyal service. In Nobunaga's hands, tea ceremony became a tool of statecraft, but also something more, a space where even a warlord could find moments of peace, of aesthetic contemplation, of connection to something beyond conquest and killing. The interaction between warriors and tea masters created unexpected dynamics. These tea masters, men of common birth who had achieved mastery of their art, could speak to daimyo with remarkable frankness. Inside the tea room, conventional hierarchies softened. A merchant who understood wabi-sabi better than a warrior could claim a different kind of authority. Culture provided alternative paths to recognition, to meaning, to legacy. And then there were the Christians. Portuguese Jesuit missionaries led by Francis Xavier arrived in 1549 with a mission to convert Japan to Catholicism. What followed was one of history's most remarkable episodes of cultural encounter. The Jesuits were sophisticated, educated men who learned Japanese, adapted to local customs, and made powerful arguments for their faith. Some daimyo converted, seeing potential trade advantages or genuine spiritual appeal in Christian teachings. By the 1580s, there were perhaps 300,000 Japanese Christians, churches throughout Kyushu and western Honshu, and a small but significant Christian samurai class. Imagine the strangeness of this moment. Warriors who had been raised, with Buddhist and Shinto worldviews now kneeling before crucifixes, taking Christian names, incorporating Catholic rituals into their daily lives. Some did this cynically, for political advantage, but others were genuine converts who struggled to reconcile their warrior duties with Christian prohibitions against killing. The Jesuit archives contain fascinating letters from Japanese Christians wrestling with these contradictions, seeking guidance on whether a samurai could be a true Christian when his lord might command him to commit acts and his religion forbade. The cultural fusion produced remarkable artifacts. Christian imagery appeared in Japanese art forms. Samurai commissioned Namban Southern barbarian-style armor decorated with Christian crosses. Folding screens depicted Portuguese ships and priests in Japanese artistic styles. For a few decades, a truly hybrid culture seemed possible, but Christianity also created tensions. Buddhist monasteries, already weakened by centuries of warrior depredations, saw the new faith as an existential threat. Some daimyo worried about Christian warriors' loyalty. Would they obey their lord or their god if forced to choose? And the underlying political implications troubled those working toward unification. Christianity came from outside Japan, representing foreign powers with their own agendas. Nobunaga himself was generally tolerant of Christianity, seeing it as useful counterweight to Buddhist institutions he despised. The Buddhist monasteries, particularly the militant Iko-Ikki, warrior monks and peasant followers of true Pure Land Buddhism, had become powers in their own right, controlling territories, raising armies, defying daimyo authority. Nobunaga waged brutal campaigns against them, besieging their fortress temples, slaughtering resistors. In 1571, he attacked Enryaku-ji, the ancient monastery complex on Mount Hiei near Kyoto, burning it completely and killing thousands of monks. It was a shocking act of cultural destruction that demonstrated how thoroughly the old order had collapsed. Yet even in this chaos, art flourished. This paradox is worth contemplating. Some of Japan's greatest cultural achievements emerged during its most violent era. Why? Perhaps because uncertainty makes beauty more precious. Perhaps because warriors who faced death constantly sought meaning through cultural creation. Or perhaps simply because the daimyo competed not just militarily but culturally, each wanting his domain to be known for aesthetic excellence as well as martial prowess. Castle architecture itself became an art form. The great castles built during the late Sengoku period, Himeji, Matsumoto, Hikone, are masterpieces that combine defensive functionality with stunning beauty. White plastered walls rose in curves that were both elegant and practical. Multiple roof levels created distinctive silhouettes. Interior spaces were decorated with screens painted by the greatest artists of the age. Gold leaf backgrounds, pine trees, and cranes, tigers in bamboo groves, all executed with supreme confidence and skill. The Kano school of painters dominated this period, producing generation after generation of artists who created monumental works for castle interiors. Their style, bold, decorative, commanding, perfectly suited the aesthetic of powerful warlords. But they were also subtle craftsmen who understood how to use empty space, how to suggest depth, how to create compositions that rewarded contemplation. Life in a castle town had its own rhythms. The merchant quarters were vibrant, chaotic places where commerce and craftsmanship flourished. Sword polishers, armor makers, bow crafters, all the specialists required to equip samurai found steady work. But also, potters creating tea ceremony utensils, weavers producing silk for kimono, carpenters building the wooden structures that defined Japanese architecture, calligraphers writing letters and documents, doctors treating wounds and illnesses with herbal medicines and surgical techniques that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Women in castle towns occupied complex positions. Samurai wives managed households, raised children, maintained family honor. But there were also women who found different paths. Some ran businesses, restaurants, shops, even sake breweries. Prostitution was organized into licensed quarters, where high-ranking courtesans, the Taiyu, cultivated artistic skills, conversed with samurai about poetry and music, and wielded significant cultural influence. The boundaries between respectability and stigma were more fluid than later periods would allow. For the common samurai serving in these domains, life was more structured than for their Kamakura predecessors, but also more precarious. You lived in your lord's castle town, in a residence appropriate to your rank. You trained constantly now with firearms as well as traditional weapons. You performed guard duty, collected taxes, settled disputes, and prepared for the next campaign, because there was always a next campaign. Warfare in the Sengoku period was frequent but followed patterns. Campaigns were seasonal. Fighting happened primarily in the summer months after spring planting and before autumn harvest, when roads were passable and peasant conscripts could be spared from agricultural work. Armies marched, besieged castles, fought battles, then returned home. A warrior might spend most of his life preparing for combat without ever fighting a major engagement. When battle came, it was chaotic, terrifying, and utterly transformative for those who survived. Imagine the noise: thousands of men shouting war cries, conch shells blowing, drums beating, guns firing, arrows whistling through air. The visual confusion: banners everywhere, armor and weapons glinting, dust or smoke obscuring vision. The physical strain: wearing armor in summer heat, running, climbing, fighting hand to hand when formations broke down. Heads were taken as proof of kills, bringing rewards based on the victim's rank. A common foot soldier's head was worth less than a mounted samurai's, which was worth less than an officer's. This created incentives but also gruesome realities. After battles, the ground was littered with decapitated corpses. The ritual of head inspection, where kills were formally verified, cleaned and presented to the lord, was simultaneously bureaucratic and macabre. Some warriors specialized in taking heads from powerful enemies, a dangerous profession requiring exceptional skill. Others focused on first-rank achievements, being the first to engage the enemy, the first to breach walls, the first to enter an enemy castle. These distinctions mattered intensely for reputation and reward. But combat was only part of warfare. Siegecraft became highly developed. Engineers understood how to undermine walls, how to build siege towers, how to construct protected approaches. Psychological warfare was practiced systematically, spreading rumors, bribing enemy retainers, assassinating key figures. Espionage networks gathered intelligence about enemy plans and dispositions. This brings us to the shinobi, what we now call ninja. They were the shadow counterparts to samurai ideals, warriors who fought without honor, who used deception, poison, infiltration, and assassination. Every major daimyo employed them, though their existence was rarely acknowledged openly. They came primarily from specific mountain regions, Iga and Koga, where communities had developed specialized skills over generations. The shinobi's methods contradicted everything samurai claimed to value, yet they were essential. A shinobi could infiltrate an enemy castle disguised as a servant, start a fire at a crucial moment, or eliminate a key commander before battle. They gathered intelligence that saved lives and won campaigns. The existence of shinobi revealed an uncomfortable truth. Samurai honor was situational, pragmatic. When survival or victory required dishonorable methods, daimyo used them. The most successful daimyo understood this complexity. Nobunaga had no qualms about using any method that worked. His successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, rose from peasant origins to become the most powerful man in Japan through a combination of military skill, political genius, and utter ruthlessness. Hideyoshi completed Nobunaga's unification project after Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582 by one of his own generals. By 1590, Hideyoshi had brought all of Japan under his control. Hideyoshi's reign was paradoxical. He attempted to freeze the social mobility that had made his own rise possible, issuing edicts that restricted peasants to farming and warriors to warfare. He conducted sword hunts, confiscating weapons from non-samurai. He expelled Christian missionaries after deciding their religion threatened social order. Yet he also patronized art lavishly, held magnificent tea ceremonies, built Osaka Castle, the largest castle ever constructed in Japan, and launched disastrous invasions of Korea that accomplished nothing except enormous suffering. The Korean campaigns of 1592 and 1597 were catastrophes. Hideyoshi, perhaps driven by megalomania, or simply seeking to keep his warrior class occupied, decided to conquer Ming China via Korea. Japanese armies landed with overwhelming force, armed with superior firearms and experienced in constant warfare. They advanced rapidly, but Korean naval forces under Admiral Yi Sun-sin, using turtle ships, armored warships with devastating firepower, cut Japanese supply lines. Korean and Ming forces regrouped. The war devolved into stalemate, then retreat. Thousands of Japanese warriors died for no purpose. Hideyoshi himself died in 1598, and his forces withdrew. Yet, even this disaster produced cultural legacies. Japanese warriors brought Korean potters back to Japan, some captured, some enticed with promises of good treatment. These Korean potters transformed Japanese ceramics, introducing techniques and aesthetics that remain influential today. The tea bowls created by Korean potters in Japanese kilns became treasured items, embodying the complex interactions between nations. After Hideyoshi's death, power fell to Tokugawa Ieyasu, another of Nobunaga's former generals. Ieyasu was patient, cautious, willing to wait for the right moment. That moment came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, a single day's fighting that determined Japan's future. Ieyasu's forces defeated a coalition of rivals through a combination of superior positioning and political maneuvering. He had secretly convinced key enemy commanders to switch sides at crucial moments. It was a victory won as much through negotiation as combat. In 1603, Ieyasu received the title of shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for 265 years. The Sengoku period was ending. The age of continuous warfare was giving way to an era of enforced peace. The last great siege, Osaka Castle in 1614 and 1615, where Hideyoshi's son made a final stand, saw 100,000 warriors deployed with the latest military technology. When it ended, with the castle in flames and the Toyotomi line extinguished, something fundamental shifted. Japan was unified. The land of 10,000 castles would be rationalized, many fortifications destroyed to prevent rebellion. The samurai who had lived by warfare would have to find new purposes. The culture that had developed during a century and a half of chaos, that remarkable fusion of martial prowess and artistic refinement, of brutal violence and exquisite beauty, would evolve again. But before we move forward, Consider what the Sengoku period achieved. It demonstrated that destruction and creation are not opposites, but different aspects of is the same energy. It showed that the most violent eras can produce profound cultural works. It proved that adaptation matters more than tradition when circumstances change completely, and it revealed that Japanese culture possessed extraordinary resilience, the capacity to absorb foreign influences, survive internal chaos, and emerge transformed but recognizably itself. The castles still stand, those that survived. Walk through Himeji Castle today, climb its steep staircases, look out from its highest tower, and you can sense what it meant to build such monuments in an age of war. They were expressions of power, certainly, but also expressions of hope, the belief that despite present chaos, something enduring could be created, something that would outlast the builder, outlast the age, outlast even the social system that produced it. The sun sets on the Sengoku period. The last battles are fought. The last great castles are completed. A new age is beginning, an age of peace so complete that it will last longer than any comparable period in human history. But the warrior culture forged in the crucible of endless warfare will not disappear. It will transform, finding new expressions, new meanings, new ways to serve purposes its creators never imagined. That transformation is our next chapter. There is something profoundly strange about a warrior class that has no wars to fight. For more than 2 centuries, from 1603 until 1868, the samurai of Tokugawa Japan found themselves in precisely this predicament. The shogunate had unified the nation, crushed all opposition, and established a peace so complete that it endured longer than most civilizations exist. What happens to warriors when warfare vanishes? What becomes of a culture built entirely around combat when combat becomes theoretical? The answer, as we shall discover, is both unexpected and deeply revealing about human adaptability. Tokugawa Ieyasu was a master of control. He witnessed decades of chaos. He was determined to create a system that would prevent its recurrence. He built his capital at Edo, modern Tokyo, deliberately choosing a location away from the old power centers of Kyoto and Osaka. From this eastern stronghold, the Tokugawa shogunate implemented policies designed to freeze Japan in a stable configuration. The Sankin Kotai system was perhaps the most ingenious. Every daimyo was required to maintain a residence in Edo and spend alternating years there, attending upon the shogun. When the daimyo returned to his domain, his family remained in Edo as hostages. This meant that daimyo spent enormous sums on maintaining 2 complete households, on the processions required for traveling between domain and capital, on the gifts and entertainment expected in Edo. They were kept too poor and too busy to contemplate rebellion. Picture these processions, hundreds of retainers marching in strict formation, carrying the daimyo's banners and family crests, protecting his palanquin. Common people were required to prostrate themselves as the procession passed. The journey from distant domains could take weeks. The highways of Japan, particularly the Tokaido Road connecting Edo and Kyoto, became rivers of constant traffic, lined with post stations providing accommodation and services. The samurai who made up these processions found themselves in an odd position. They wore their 2 swords, the mark of their status, but the swords were primarily symbolic. The chance of actually using them in combat was vanishingly small. They wore elaborate hairstyles and formal dress, but increasingly their role was ceremonial rather than martial. They were, in essence, actors performing the idea of warriorhood. Consider the daily life of a middle-ranking samurai in Edo during the 18th century. His name is Tanaka Saburo, fictional, but representative of thousands like him. He serves the Maeda clan, whose domain is far to the north, but he resides in Edo year-round as part of the administrative staff maintaining the clan's compound. His day begins early. In the small house provided by his stipend, modest but clean, with tatami mats and sliding paper doors. He rises, bathes, and dresses carefully. His top knot must be perfect, oiled and positioned just so. His two swords, katana and wakizashi, are cleaned and checked, though he will not draw them today, or tomorrow, or likely ever except in practice. His clothing is formal: hakama trousers, kimono with the clan crest, perhaps a haori jacket if the weather requires. He eats a simple breakfast of rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, maybe dried fish. His wife manages the household budget carefully, because their stipend measured in rice has not increased in generations while prices have risen. Many samurai families struggle financially, taking side work that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Some samurai craft umbrellas or sandals in secret. Others tutor merchant children in literacy and mathematics. The proud warrior class is quietly impoverished. After breakfast, Saburo walks to the clan compound, a significant complex with multiple buildings, walls, and gates. He serves in the administrative section, maintaining records of the clan's retainers, processing requests, managing correspondence with the home domain. His calligraphy must be perfect. His knowledge of protocol and precedent must be comprehensive. He is, in effect, a bureaucrat who happens to carry swords. His morning might include staff meetings where officials discuss mundane matters, a retainer requesting permission to marry, financial accounts needing reconciliation, a minor dispute between retainers requiring mediation. The atmosphere is formal, hierarchical, intensely focused on proper procedure. This is warrior culture channeled into paperwork, but samurai were still required to maintain martial skills. After administrative duties, Saburo goes to the training hall. Here, the old ways persist in modified form. He practices kata formal sequences of sword movements with wooden practice swords. He rehearses drawing techniques, the smooth, flowing motion from sheath to cut to return. He engages in controlled sparring using bamboo swords, wearing protective armor. This is different from the battlefield training of Sengoku warriors. It is more refined, more ritualized, more concerned with perfect form than practical lethality. Sword schools proliferate, each claiming ancient lineages and secret techniques. Masters compete for students and patronage. The emphasis shifts from killing efficiently to embodying philosophical principles through physical practice. The afternoon might bring guard duty, standing at gates, patrolling walls, maintaining security that is almost never challenged. Or perhaps he will attend a lecture on Confucian philosophy, because samurai are expected to be educated. The shogunate promotes Neo-Confucianism as the official ideology, emphasizing loyalty, hierarchy, and social harmony. Samurai study the Chinese classics, debate the proper interpretation of ancient texts, write essays demonstrating their learning. Evening approaches. Saburo returns home, changes into more comfortable clothing, and perhaps spends time with his children. His son, now 10 years old, is learning to read, practicing calligraphy, and beginning sword training. The boy will inherit his father's position, and stipend samurai status is now hereditary and fixed. There is no social mobility, no opportunity to rise through merit, as in the Sengoku period. You are born samurai or you are not, and that determines your entire life. His daughter, 8 years old, is learning the arts appropriate to a samurai woman: sewing, flower arrangement, tea ceremony, music. She will be married to another samurai family when she comes of age, cementing alliances, continuing the web of relationships that structures their world. Her education includes literacy, unusual in many cultures, but Japanese women of the samurai class are expected to read and write, to manage household accounts, to maintain cultural standards. After dinner, Saburo might practice calligraphy, copying classical poems or Buddhist texts, or he might read the Edo period, sees an explosion of literacy and publishing. Books are expensive but available. He might own a few volumes, military strategy classics, philosophical treatises, perhaps collections of poetry. If he's careful with money, he might occasionally purchase woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, those remarkable images that capture the floating world of urban entertainment. The floating world, ukiyo. This concept captures something essential about Edo period culture. It refers to the pleasure quarters, the entertainment districts where samurai, merchants, and artisans mingled in spaces temporarily freed from strict social hierarchies. The largest and most famous was Yoshiwara in Edo, a licensed district where prostitution, theatre, restaurants, and tea houses created a parallel world devoted to sensory pleasure and aesthetic experience. Theoretically, samurai were supposed to maintain dignified distance from such places. Practically, many were regular visitors. The high-ranking courtesans Oiran were celebrities, known for beauty, wit, and artistic accomplishments. A night with a top-ranked Oiran required enormous expense and elaborate protocol. These women were not simply prostitutes but cultural arbiters who set fashion, influenced art, and in some cases wielded significant economic power. The relationship between samurai culture and the floating world was complex, even contradictory. Official ideology emphasized austerity, duty, and self-restraint. But humans need release, need pleasure, need spaces where the burden of maintaining social roles can be temporarily set aside. The pleasure quarters provided this, and they became laboratories for artistic innovation. Kabuki theatre emerged in these entertainment districts, wildly popular, visually spectacular, emotionally intense. Kabuki plays often featured samurai characters, but presented them in ways that official culture never would. Samurai torn between duty and love, samurai making questionable ethical choices, samurai as fully human rather than idealized paragons. The best kabuki actors became superstars, their images reproduced in ukiyo-e prints that circulated widely. The prints themselves, woodblock prints, were a democratic art form. Unlike paintings commissioned by wealthy patrons, prints could be mass-produced and sold cheaply. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige created landscapes of stunning beauty. Mount Fuji seen from different perspectives, rain falling on bridges, waves frozen in impossible curves. Other artists depicted the floating world directly. Courtesans in elaborate kimono, actors in dramatic poses, lovers in intimate moments. These prints reached every level of society. Merchants hung them in their homes. Samurai collected them despite official disapproval. They were exported to Europe in the 19th century, where they revolutionized Western art. Impressionists and post-impressionists studied them obsessively, learning new approaches to composition, color, and perspective. The contradiction at the heart of Edo culture that the rigid, hierarchical, official world coexisted with and even depended upon its sensual, transgressive shadow reveals something profound about human societies. We require order, and we require release. We need structure, and we need escape. The genius of Edo culture was creating spaces where both could exist, each in its proper sphere. But let us return to our samurai, Saburo. Once a month, perhaps, he might venture into the floating world. He goes discreetly. Without his swords, they would mark him too obviously. He might visit a bathhouse where he can relax completely, or attend a kabuki performance, losing himself in the drama, or simply walk the streets of the pleasure quarter, observing the parade of humanity, the gorgeous kimono, the music floating from tea houses, the lanterns lighting the night. These excursions are expensive, probably more than he can truly afford. His wife knows but does not speak of it, because this is how their world functions. She manages the household with the resources available, economizes where possible, maintains the family's dignity even when the budget barely stretches to cover necessities. The economic reality of Edo samurai life was increasingly difficult. Stipends remained fixed while the economy transformed. Japan in the 18th century was developing a sophisticated monetary economy. Merchants grew wealthy through commerce, cities expanded, consumer culture flourished, but samurai, locked into rice stipends that hadn't increased in generations, found themselves relatively impoverished. This created cognitive dissonance. Officially, samurai were the highest social class above farmers, artisans, and merchants in the Confucian hierarchy. Practically, wealthy merchants lived in luxury, while many samurai struggled. Some merchants were so rich they could loan money to daimyo, effectively controlling those supposedly superior to them. The official ideology claimed money was vulgar and samurai honor more valuable than wealth. But try living on honor when rice prices rise. Some domains addressed this by encouraging samurai to develop commercial enterprises. Others maintained strict separation of classes, viewing any samurai involvement in commerce as degrading. Individual samurai made choices: maintain prideful poverty, or find ways to earn additional income through teaching, craft work, or even adopting into merchant families who would pay handsomely for samurai status. The children of such arrangements, merchant families who purchased samurai status through adoption, added another layer of complexity. They had wealth but lacked the cultural training of hereditary samurai. They had status, but not always the respect that should accompany it. The boundaries between classes, supposedly fixed and immutable, were actually permeable in surprising ways. Education became increasingly important. The shogunate and various domains established schools where young samurai studied Confucian texts, military strategy, history, and calligraphy. But private schools terracotta also proliferated, teaching basic literacy and mathematics to commoners. By the late Edo period, Japan had one of the highest literacy rates in the world. This would prove crucial when modernization came. Some samurai became scholars of exceptional depth. They studied not just the Confucian classics but also Dutch learning Rangaku, which entered Japan through the single Dutch trading post permitted at Nagasaki. Through Dutch books, Japanese intellectuals learned about Western science, medicine, astronomy, and geography. They created detailed translations, built up technical vocabularies, and gradually assembled a picture of the wider world from which Japan was largely isolated. This isolation was deliberate policy. In the 1630s, the shogunate had sealed the country's sakoku. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad on pain of death. Foreign ships were prohibited from entering Japanese ports, with limited exceptions. Christianity was ruthlessly suppressed. Converts were forced to renounce their faith, imprisoned, tortured, or executed. The suspicion of foreign influence ran deep, born from the chaos that foreign guns and foreign religion had contributed to during the Sengoku period. The persecution of Christians in the early Edo period was particularly brutal. The Shimabara rebellion of 1637, a peasant uprising, led partly by Christian converts, resulted in mass slaughter. 37,000 rebels were killed after a lengthy siege. Afterward, the shogunate implemented systematic measures to root out any remaining Christians, requiring people to register at Buddhist temples, forcing suspected Christians to step on religious images, creating networks of neighborhood informants. Christianity went underground. Hidden Christians, Kakure Kirishitan, maintained their faith in secret for generations, blending Catholic practices with Buddhist and Shinto elements to avoid detection. They passed down prayers and rituals through oral tradition, their religion evolving in isolation into something unique. When Japan finally opened to the West in the 19th century, authorities were surprised to discover communities of Christians who had preserved their faith through 2 centuries of persecution. But for most samurai in the Middle Edo period, these religious concerns were distant. Their spiritual lives combined Confucian ethics, Zen meditation practices, and Shinto shrine visits in an unproblematic synthesis. They participated in seasonal festivals, observed death anniversaries of ancestors, and generally practiced religion as cultural tradition rather than fervent faith. The warrior philosophy Bushido, the way of the warrior, was being codified during this period. The text Hagakure, written in the early 18th century by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, is perhaps the most famous expression of this philosophy. Its opening line is stark: "I have found that the way of the samurai is death." Tsunetomo argued that a true samurai should be prepared to die at any moment, should make decisions as if already dead, should value honor and loyalty above life itself. This was a philosophy of absolute commitment, of finding freedom through total surrender to duty. It was also, arguably, nostalgia for a vanished age. Tsunetomo wrote decades into the Edo peace, looking back at the Sengoku period with romantic longing. His work was not widely read in his own time, but would be rediscovered and promoted by militarists in the 20th century, sometimes with tragic results. Other writers offered different visions. Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary swordsman who lived through the transition from Sengoku warfare to Edo peace, wrote The Book of Five Rings, a text on strategy and the sword that emphasized adaptability, studying multiple disciplines, and understanding the larger context of conflict. Musashi fought over 60 duels, survived the great battles of his era, and eventually became a wanderer, a ronin, before settling down to paint and write. His approach was more pragmatic than Tsunetomo's, focused on effectiveness rather than philosophical purity. The ronin masterless samurai were a persistent problem in Edo society. Some lost their masters through defeat in the wars that established the Tokugawa regime. Others were released when domains were reorganized or abolished. Still others became ronin through their own actions, failing in duty, committing crimes, or simply choosing to leave service. Without a master, a samurai lost his stipend, his position, his place in the social order. Some ronin found new employment. Others became teachers of martial arts. Some descended into poverty, becoming little better than bandits. The most desperate might sell their swords, literal and figurative, hiring themselves out for assassination or intimidation. The famous story of the 47 Ronin captures this complexity. In 1701, a daimyo named Asano Naganori was provoked into drawing his sword in Edo Castle, a capital crime, and was ordered to commit seppuku. His retainers became ronin, but 47 of them secretly planned revenge. For nearly 2 years they waited, pretending to be drunken wastrels while actually preparing. Finally, on a snowy night in 1703, they attacked the mansion of the official who had provoked their lord, killed him, and brought his head to their master's grave. This act violated the shogunate's prohibition on private vengeance. The ronin were ordered to commit seppuku, which they did with dignity. They became instant folk heroes, warriors who exemplified absolute loyalty, who fulfilled their duty regardless of personal cost, who embodied the samurai ideal even as they violated the law. Their story was dramatized in countless plays, novels, and eventually films. Their graves at Sengakuji Temple in Tokyo remain pilgrimage sites where people still leave offerings. The Ronin story reveals tensions at the heart of Edo samurai culture. Official ideology demanded obedience to the shogunate's laws, but deeper values loyalty to one's lord. The obligation to avenge wrongs sometimes conflicted with those laws. When they conflicted, which should take precedence? The shogunate's solution, ordering the ronin to commit suicide, but treating them with honor, was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but allowed both values to be acknowledged. Seppuku itself, ritual suicide by disembowelment, was a practice that disturbed foreigners but made sense within samurai logic. It was a way to preserve honor in defeat, to take responsibility for failure, to demonstrate ultimate sincerity through willingness to inflict terrible pain upon oneself. Properly performed, with a kaishakunin, a second standing ready to complete the death with a decapitating sword stroke at the moment of maximum agony, it was considered the most honorable death possible. In practice, seppuku was rare in the Edo period. The ritual existed more as potential than actuality, a way of saying that some values matter more than life, that honor is not just a word but something worth dying for. The existence of the ritual shaped behavior, even when it wasn't performed. For samurai women, honor had its own demands. They were trained in the naginata and sometimes the dagger because defending the home was their responsibility. They were also taught that suicide might be necessary if capture was imminent, if family honor required it. The method was different, cutting the throat or stabbing the heart, often after binding one's legs together to ensure dying in a modest position. These expectations seem harsh to modern sensibilities, and they were, but they reflected a worldview where individual life was less important than family continuity, where present suffering was accepted if it maintained honor for future generations. Women who embodied these values, who managed households efficiently, raised children properly, and maintained dignity in hardship were respected, even if their names rarely entered historical records. Some women, however, achieved broader recognition. Female artists, poets, and intellectuals existed even in this constrained world. Women from wealthy merchant families often received excellent educations. Some ran businesses, managed estates, or influenced cultural trends through their salon-like gatherings. The constraints were real, but human creativity finds paths even through narrow openings. As the Edo period progressed into the 19th century, the system's strains became increasingly obvious. The economy had outgrown the rigid social structure. Merchant wealth contradicted the supposed hierarchy. Samurai poverty undermined their claim to superiority. Rural areas suffered periodic famines. The Tenmei famine of the 1780s killed hundreds of thousands, exposing the government's inability to manage crisis effectively. The Tenpo famine of the 1830s was even worse, leading to urban riots and rural rebellions. Intellectuals began questioning whether the system could continue indefinitely. Some advocated reforms, adjusting stipends, allowing more social mobility, modernizing administration. Others argued for return to imagined ancient purity. A few studied the West through Dutch learning and wondered if Japan's isolation was sustainable in a changing world. They were right to wonder, because beyond Japan's closed borders, the world was transforming at an accelerating pace. Industrial revolution, steam, power, modern weapons, global trade networks, forces were building that would soon crash against Japan's shores. The floating world's shadow warriors, living their ritualized lives of ceremony and restraint, were about to face a challenge unlike anything in their history. The 2-century peace was ending, not through internal collapse, but through external intrusion. Black ships would appear in Japanese harbors, carrying messages that could not be ignored, representing power that could not be dismissed. And the samurai warriors who had not fought wars in generations would have to decide what their warrior culture meant when confronted with threats their ancestors never imagined. The sun sets on another day in Edo. Saburo returns home from his duties, performs his evening rituals, and prepares for sleep. He does not know that his son's generation will witness the complete transformation of their world. He cannot imagine that within decades, the samurai class will be abolished, the swords banned, the entire structure of their society dismantled. He lives in what appears to be eternal present, stable and unchanging. But nothing human is eternal, and change, when it finally comes, will be swift and overwhelming. That reckoning approaches, and it is time we witnessed it. On the 8th of July, 1853, 4 black ships appeared in Edo Bay. They were American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, and they carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to trade. The ships were steam-powered. They moved without sails, belching smoke, seemingly propelled by infernal forces. Their guns could bombard Edo from the bay. Japan had nothing comparable. Imagine standing on the shore that summer day, watching those alien vessels approach. For 2.5 centuries, Japan had maintained its isolation. The world beyond had been kept at arm's length, known only through the trickle of information that came through the Dutch at Nagasaki. Now, suddenly, that world had arrived uninvited, bearing demands backed by overwhelming technological superiority. The shogunate was paralyzed with indecision. Accept Perry's demands and abandon the isolation that had defined the Edo period. Refuse and face military conflict Japan could not win. Seek advice from the imperial court in Kyoto. Admitting weakness? The very act of asking what to do revealed that the shogun's authority was crumbling. Perry departed, promising to return the next year for an answer. Those months of waiting were filled with desperate activity. Coastal defences were hastily constructed obsolete fortifications that might slow but could never stop a modern naval bombardment. Debate raged among officials, intellectuals, and samurai. The nation's fundamental assumptions about itself and its place in the world were being questioned. When Perry returned in February 1854 with an even larger fleet, the shogunate capitulated. The Treaty of Kanagawa opened 2 ports to American ships for provisions and established a permanent American consulate. It was the crack in the dam. Soon, similar treaties with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands followed. Japan's isolation was ending, and with it, the entire structure of Tokugawa rule would begin to disintegrate. For samurai throughout Japan, Perry's arrival was traumatic. Everything they had been taught about Japanese superiority, about the virtue of their system, the strength of their traditions, was suddenly called into question. Those black ships represented power beyond Japanese comprehension. How had the foreign barbarians developed such capabilities? What did it mean about Japan's past 2 centuries of isolation? Some samurai responded with xenophobic fury. The slogan, Sono Joy, emerged. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Young warriors from southwestern domains, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, began attacking foreigners and anyone perceived as collaborating with them. In 1862, a British merchant named Charles Richardson was killed by Satsuma samurai for not showing proper respect to a daimyo's procession. The resulting diplomatic crisis and British retaliation demonstrated again Japanese military inadequacy. But other samurai drew different conclusions. They recognized that Japan must learn from the West or be dominated by it. The question was not whether to change, but how to change while preserving Japanese identity. Some advocated selective adoption of Western technology while maintaining traditional values. Others argued for more comprehensive transformation. The shogunate, seeking solutions, sent missions abroad. In 1860, the first official embassy traveled to the United States, a delegation of samurai who had never left Japan, encountering America at the brink of its civil war. They rode steamships and trains, saw factories and telegraphs, attended formal dinners where they struggled with Western utensils and customs. They returned with detailed reports describing Western institutions, technology, and military organization. These early travelers experienced profound cognitive dissonance. The power and wealth they witnessed contradicted everything they believed about barbarian inferiority. American and European cities were larger, cleaner, more technologically advanced than anything in Japan. The industrial capacity was staggering. The military power was undeniable, yet the social systems seemed chaotic. Merchants and commoners wielding influence, women appearing in public spaces, religious diversity rather than hierarchical order. Individual samurai processed these experiences differently. Some felt humiliation, we are so far behind, so backward, so weak. Others felt determination, we can learn, we can adapt, we can become strong again. Still others felt confusion if we adopt their ways. What remains distinctively Japanese? If we abandon our traditions, who are we? Fukuzawa Yukichi was one such traveler. Born into a low-ranking samurai family, he had studied Dutch learning and then English, becoming one of the few Japanese who could communicate with Westerners. He traveled to America and Europe multiple times in the 1860s, observing everything with keen intelligence. His books describing Western civilization became bestsellers in Japan, introducing concepts like individual rights, market economics, and scientific methodology to readers hungry for understanding. Fukuzawa argued passionately for learning from the West. He wrote, "Heaven did not create people above people, nor did it create people below people." This was revolutionary, a direct challenge to the hierarchical worldview that structured Japanese society. He advocated education for all, gender equality, rational inquiry over tradition-bound thinking. His ideas influenced an entire generation, but not everyone agreed. Conservative samurai argued that Western learning would destroy Japanese spirit, that technological adoption must be balanced by preservation of traditional ethics. The tension between these positions, wholesale Westernization versus selective modernization, would shape Japan's transformation and continues to echo in debates today. Meanwhile, the shogunate was collapsing. The treaties with Western powers included provisions that Japan had not fully understood extraterritoriality, allowing foreigners to be tried under their own laws, and fixed low tariffs that prevented Japan from protecting domestic industries. These unequal treaties became symbols of national humiliation. The shogunate, having signed them, was blamed for weakness. Opposition centered increasingly around the emperor. For centuries, emperors had reigned in Kyoto as sacred but powerless figures. Now, anti-shogunate forces began advocating restoration of imperial rule not because they wanted the emperor to actually govern, but because imperial legitimacy provided a rallying point against Tokugawa authority. Restore the emperor really meant overthrow the shogunate. The domains of Satsuma and Choshu led this movement. They were southwestern domains that had been on the losing side at Sekigahara 2.5 centuries earlier, forced into submission but never fully reconciled to Tokugawa rule. Now they saw opportunity. Their young samurai were fired with idealistic fervor, willing to die for the cause of restoration. They also recognized practical realities. They purchased Western weapons, studied Western military tactics, and prepared for conflict. In 1863, Choshu forces fired on Western ships passing through the Shimonoseki Strait, implementing the "Expel the Barbarians" part of their slogan. The result was disaster. A combined Western fleet retaliated, bombarding Choshu fortifications into rubble, demonstrating again the futility of resisting Western military power with traditional means. The lesson was clear. You cannot expel the barbarians through force. You can only become strong enough that they respect you. This realization transformed the anti-shogunate movement. The slogan remained, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," but the meaning shifted. Now it meant, restore imperial rule, modernize Japan, build strength sufficient to renegotiate the unequal treaties, and stand as equals with Western powers. It was nationalism channeled toward transformation rather than reaction. The shogunate, recognizing its weakness, attempted reforms. They modernized the military along French lines, established Western-style factories, and created a modern navy. But these reforms were too little, too late, and too compromised by internal opposition. Conservative elements within the shogunate resisted change. Domains maintained independence. The entire structure was fragmenting. For individual samurai, these years were agonizing. Where did loyalty lie? To the shogun who had ruled for 2 centuries? To the emperor who represented legitimate authority? To one's domain? To Japan itself? Different samurai answered differently, and families split over the question. Brother fought brother, father disowned son. The bonds that had held samurai society together were tearing apart. Some samurai became shishi, men of high purpose, dedicated revolutionaries willing to use assassination and terrorism to advance their cause. They targeted shogunate officials, foreigners, and anyone they deemed obstacles to restoration. Kyoto in the mid-1860s was extremely dangerous, with nightly assassinations creating an atmosphere of terror. The Shinsengumi, a special police force of shogunate loyalists, fought the shishi in a shadow war of raids and ambushes. This was not the stylized combat of earlier eras. This was close quarters fighting in dark streets, sudden attacks in rooms and corridors, brutal efficiency rather than martial elegance. The participants were often young men barely out of adolescence, idealistic and ruthless, willing to die for causes they barely understood. The casualty rate was horrific. Women, too, were caught in these conflicts. Some actively participated, carrying messages, hiding fugitives, even fighting. Others suffered as their husbands, sons, and brothers joined opposing sides. The wife, who had always embodied loyalty and obedience, but loyal to whom when everything was chaos? Obedient to what when all structures were collapsing? By 1867, the shogunate's position was untenable. The new shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was young, intelligent, and pragmatic enough to recognize reality. In November of that year, he resigned, returning political authority to the emperor. It was an attempt to preserve some influence while acknowledging that the old system could not continue. The emperor, or rather, those who controlled the emperor, accepted the resignation and declared the restoration of imperial rule. This was the Meiji Restoration, named for the new era name chosen by the teenage emperor Meiji. It was presented as a return to ancient patterns, but it was actually a revolution. Within a few years, the entire structure of Tokugawa society would be dismantled and rebuilt along Western lines. But first, there was a brief civil war. Some shogunate loyalists, particularly in northern domains, refused to accept the restoration. The Boshin War of 1868 and 1869 saw modernized armies both sides using Western weapons and tactics fighting across Japan. The pro-imperial forces, led by Satsuma and Choshu, had superior organization and Western support. They won decisively. The last stand of traditional samurai warfare came at Hakodate in Hokkaido, where a small fleet of shogunate ships and several thousand warriors held out for months before surrendering in May 1869. It was the end of an era, the final battle where samurai fought as samurai, wearing their armor, wielding their swords, serving their lords unto death. Except it was not quite the end. Not yet. The real transformation came through legislation rather than combat. In 1871, the domains were abolished, replaced by prefectures under central government control. The daimyo became governors, then pensioners. In 1873, conscription was introduced. All men, regardless of class, could be drafted into a modern army. This shattered the samurai monopoly on military service. Why maintain an expensive warrior class when peasant conscripts with rifles were more effective? In 1876 came the most devastating blow, the Sword Abolishment Edict. Samurai were prohibited from wearing swords in public. The two swords, the mark of their status, the symbol of their identity, the physical embodiment of their warrior soul, were banned. Imagine the psychological impact. For generations, a samurai without his swords was inconceivable. Now, overnight, they were forbidden. That same year, the hereditary stipends that had supported samurai families for centuries were converted to government bonds, and devalued bonds at that, worth a fraction of the rice stipends they replaced. Financially and symbolically, the samurai class was being eliminated. Some accepted this. They recognized that Japan needed modernization, that the samurai system was obsolete, that sacrifice was necessary for national survival. They found new roles as teachers, police officers, bureaucrats, businessmen. They carried samurai values, discipline, loyalty, education, into modern professions. They became the core of the emerging middle class. But others could not accept it. How could centuries of tradition be discarded? How could a warrior identity built on military service survive when warriors were no longer needed? For samurai who had invested their entire sense of self in their status, the Meiji reforms were existential catastrophe. Rebellion was inevitable. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, one of the heroes of the Restoration, a man who had been instrumental in overthrowing the shogunate, led a revolt in Satsuma. He commanded about 40,000 former samurai who rejected the new order. They fought with swords and traditional weapons against the conscript army, equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The Satsuma Rebellion lasted 8 months. It was a massacre. The government forces, including many former samurai who had accepted the new system, systematically crushed the rebels. Saigo died in the final battle, possibly by his own hand, possibly killed by gunfire, the exact circumstances lost in chaos. His rebellion was the last gasp of armed samurai resistance to modernity. The irony was profound. Saigo had fought to restore the emperor and modernize Japan, but when modernization required abolishing the samurai class, he could not accept it. He had helped create the new Japan, then died fighting against what it was becoming. He was celebrated as a tragic hero, a man of principle who chose death over compromise, embodying samurai ideals even in their final defeat. After Satsuma, there were no more rebellions. The former samurai had to adapt or fade away. Many struggled. The skills they had cultivated, swordsmanship, calligraphy, classical learning, had limited utility in the new economy. Some became impoverished, clinging to outdated pride. Others retrained, learned new trades, accepted reduced circumstances. The psychological adjustment was immense. For young people coming of age during the Restoration, the experience was disorienting. They had been raised as samurai, taught the old values, trained in traditional arts, but the world those arts were designed for no longer existed. What did it mean to be samurai when there was no samurai class? What happened to Bushido when warriors became bureaucrats? Some found answers in reinterpretation. The samurai spirit, loyalty, discipline, dedication, self-cultivation could be channeled into modern endeavors. A businessman could embody samurai ethics in his enterprise. A teacher could practice samurai dedication to duty. A police officer could maintain samurai commitment to justice. The forms changed, but the underlying values might persist. This became the dominant narrative. Samurai culture had not died but transformed, becoming part of national character rather than class privilege. Every Japanese person could now aspire to samurai virtues. The democratization of Bushido turned it from class identity into national ideology. But this narrative, however comforting, obscured real losses. The aesthetic culture that samurai had supported tea ceremony, calligraphy, sword polishing, traditional architecture lost its primary patrons. Some arts survived through dedicated practitioners who maintained traditions despite economic hardship. Others faded, techniques forgotten, lineages broken. The relationship between men and women also shifted. Western ideas about gender, roles, family structure, and women's status entered Japan, creating new confusions. Were women to be educated? Should they work outside the home? What about traditional virtues of obedience and endurance? The Meiji government promoted good wife, wise mother ideology. Women should support husbands and raise children, but with modern education enabling them to contribute to national strength. It was a compromise that satisfied no one fully. Some women found liberation in the changes. Education became available. New professions opened. The possibility of choosing one's husband rather than accepting arranged marriages began to emerge, though slowly. But traditional constraints remained strong, often strengthened by appeals to Japanese spirit against Western decadence. The overall psychological impact of these 2 decades, from Perry's arrival in 1853 to the suppression of the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877, is difficult to overstate. An entire worldview collapsed. Everything that had seemed permanent proved temporary. Every certainty dissolved. The very categories through which people understood reality were revealed as contingent, historical, changeable. Some individuals thrived in this chaos. They were adaptable, curious, willing to abandon old identities and construct new ones. They learned English, studied Western subjects, traveled abroad, and returned to build modern institutions. They became the Meiji elite, the oligarchs and bureaucrats who constructed the new Japan. Others were broken by it. They had been defined entirely by a social role that no longer existed. They were samurai, and then they were nothing. Some drank themselves to death. Some committed suicide, seeing no honorable path forward. Some simply faded, living out quiet lives of increasing irrelevance. Most fell somewhere between. They adapted imperfectly, maintaining what they could of the old ways while accommodating the new. They taught their children to honor ancestors while learning modern subjects. They preserved family heirlooms, swords, armor, scrolls as memories of a vanished world. They practiced traditional arts as hobbies rather than disciplines. They negotiated between past and present, creating hybrid identities that were both and neither. The encounter between Japan and the West in the 19th century was one of history's great collisions. 2 civilizations with entirely different assumptions about reality, value, and proper social organization forced into sudden, intense interaction. Neither emerged unchanged. Japan transformed itself with astonishing speed, preserving elements of traditional culture while adopting Western technology and institutions. The West, particularly after Japan demonstrated its modernization by defeating China in 1894 and Russia in 1905, had to revise its assumptions about Asian inferiority and European civilizational supremacy. For the samurai, the collision was traumatic, but ultimately generative. Their class was abolished, their legal privileges removed, their monopoly on military service ended, but the culture they had created, the values they had embodied, the arts they had patronized, the ideals they had articulated did not disappear. Those elements were too deeply woven into Japanese society to be extracted by legislation. What happened instead was transformation and dispersion. Samurai culture became Japanese culture, available to all, the possession of the nation rather than a class. This democratization changed it, certainly made it more abstract, more ideological, more susceptible to manipulation by those who would invoke samurai spirit for political purposes. But it also ensured survival. Stand in modern Tokyo, and samurai culture is invisible yet omnipresent. The physical markers, swords, top knots, distinctive clothing are gone, but the values, dedication, discipline, loyalty, aesthetic refinement persist in business culture, educational practices, martial arts training, and countless subtle ways. The collision produced synthesis. The sun sets on the Meiji period. A new century approaches the 20th, which will bring its own terrible challenges. The choices made during these decades of transformation, what to preserve, what to discard, how to balance tradition and modernity, will shape Japan's response to those challenges. The samurai are gone. But what they created, what they represented, what they struggled to preserve, even as they recognized change was necessary, that remains, transformed, but present, ready to be reinterpreted by each new generation. There is a photograph from 1877. It shows a group of men in Western suits and bowler hats, standing stiffly before a camera, a technology still novel enough to require long exposure times. They are former samurai, members of the new police force. Look closely at their faces, and you can see the tension between worlds. Men who once carried two swords now carrying notebooks and regulations. Warriors transformed into civil servants, yet carrying something invisible forward. The question that faced Japan in the decades after the Meiji Restoration was not whether samurai culture would disappear. That was inevitable once the class itself was abolished. The real question was, what elements would survive, how would they be preserved, and what new forms would they take? The answer would shape modern Japan in ways the reformers could not have fully anticipated. Consider the police force, that symbol of modern state authority. When the Meiji government established a national police system in the 1870s, they recruited heavily from former samurai. This made practical sense. These men had discipline, literacy, and experience with authority, but it also created continuity. The values that had structured samurai behavior, loyalty, duty, martial skill, were channeled into law enforcement. Former samurai became police officers throughout Japan, bringing with them their ethos of service. They patrolled streets they once walked as privileged warriors, now enforcing laws that applied equally to all classes. The irony was not lost on them. Some struggled with the transition, seeing police work as beneath their dignity. Others embraced it, finding in law enforcement a way to continue serving society, protecting the weak, maintaining order, all traditional samurai responsibilities, just in modern form. The most visible transformation was in education. The Meiji government recognized that modernization required universal literacy and technical knowledge. They built schools throughout the country, from elementary to university level. And who staffed these schools? Disproportionately, former samurai. They became teachers, principals, educational administrators, transmitting not just academic content but values of discipline, respect, perseverance, and dedication to learning. A typical elementary school in the Meiji period was run with almost military precision. Students stood when the teacher entered. They bowed. They followed strict schedules and behavioral codes. The classroom was organized hierarchically, with clear expectations and immediate consequences for misbehavior. This was samurai discipline adapted to mass education, creating a school culture that emphasized group harmony, respect for authority, and the subordination of individual desire to collective goals. The content of education also reflected samurai influence. Classical Chinese texts, the foundation of samurai education for centuries, remained part of the curriculum, though now taught to all students rather than just the elite. Moral education emphasized loyalty to the emperor, filial piety, and dedication to national prosperity. Physical education included martial arts and military-style calisthenics. Schools were, in effect, training grounds for citizens who would embody samurai. Virtues democratized across the entire population. This educational system was remarkably effective at producing rapid modernization. Within a generation, Japan achieved literacy rates comparable to Western nations. Students mastered both traditional subjects and modern sciences. They learned to navigate between Japanese and Western knowledge systems. The speed of this transformation astonished foreign observers, who had expected Asian societies to require centuries for such changes. But this success came with costs. The emphasis on conformity, hierarchy, and obedience to authority created a population skilled at following directives, but less practiced at questioning them. The moral education that stressed loyalty and sacrifice could be and would be manipulated for nationalistic purposes. The samurai values transplanted into modern education were double-edged, productive of social cohesion and national strength, but also potentially dangerous when directed toward militaristic ends. Former samurai also entered business, though this transition was psychologically complex. Traditional samurai ideology had despised commerce as vulgar, money-grubbing, beneath warrior dignity. Confucian hierarchy placed merchants at the bottom of the social order. Yet here were former samurai entering trade, manufacturing, banking, the very activities their culture had denigrated. Some justified this through reinterpretation. Business, they argued, was another form of service to the nation. Building industrial capacity strengthened Japan against Western encroachment. Creating wealth enabled Japan to renegotiate unequal treaties and stand as an equal among nations. Approached with proper spirit, dedication, discipline, excellence, commerce could be as honorable as any samurai pursuit. Others simply needed to survive. Pride did not feed hungry children or maintain households. If becoming a merchant was necessary, then it was necessary. They brought samurai work ethic to business, attention to detail, commitment to quality, long-term thinking over short-term profit, relationships built on trust and mutual obligation. These values, merged with Western business practices, created distinctive Japanese corporate culture. The zaibatsu, massive industrial conglomerates that dominated the Meiji economy, were often founded or managed by former samurai or their children. Mitsubishi's founder, Iwasaki Yataro, came from a low-ranking samurai family and built a shipping empire through aggressive entrepreneurship, tempered by samurai discipline. The companies he created embodied both Western organizational structures and Japanese values of loyalty and long-term commitment. Within these companies, employment patterns reflected samurai relationships. Workers were not just hired labor but members of a corporate family, with obligations and protections running both directions. Lifetime employment, seniority-based promotion, extensive company welfare programs, these features of Japanese corporate culture echoed the lord-retainer bonds of samurai society. The terminology even preserved this. Employees spoke of their company using familial language, expressing loyalty that transcended mere economic calculation. Meanwhile, the actual practice of samurai martial arts was being systematically preserved and transformed. In 1895, the Dai Nippon Butoku Kai, the Greater Japan Martial Virtue Society, was established to promote traditional martial arts. This was explicit cultural preservation, documenting techniques, standardizing training, maintaining lineages that might otherwise disappear as the warrior class dispersed. Kendo, the way of the sword, evolved from combat training to spiritual discipline. Practitioners wore protective armor and used bamboo swords, practicing strikes and forms that had once been preparation for killing but now served as character development. The emphasis shifted from defeating opponents to perfecting oneself, from martial effectiveness to moral cultivation. Kendo became, explicitly, a path to building strong character, discipline, and Japanese spirit. Judo, developed by Kano Jigoro from traditional jujutsu techniques, represented an even more radical transformation. Kano removed the most dangerous techniques, created a structured curriculum from beginner to master, and framed judo as educational rather than purely martial. His vision was a physical education system that would develop mind and body together, teaching ethical behavior through physical practice. Students learned to fall safely, to yield rather than resist force, to use an opponent's strength against them, principles with broader philosophical applications. Aikido, created later by Morihei Ueshiba, took this further still. Ueshiba envisioned a martial art based on harmony rather than conflict, where the goal was not to defeat opponents but to resolve confrontation without harm. Aikido techniques redirect attacks, turning aggression into circular movements that dissipate hostile energy. It was martial art as peacemaking, warrior skill transformed into philosophy of non-violence, a profound reimagining of what warrior training could mean. These martial arts spread through schools, police training, and private dojos. They became both physical education and moral instruction, ways of transmitting samurai values, discipline, respect, perseverance, without the militaristic context. Young people who would never face combat learned martial arts as character training, connecting to warrior traditions through their bodies, even as their minds studied modern subjects. Archery underwent similar transformation. Kyudo, the way of the bow, became explicitly meditative practice. The emphasis was not hitting targets but perfecting form, cultivating correct mental state, achieving mushin no mind, where action flows without self-conscious thought. A single shot might take 5 minutes of preparation, assuming stance, controlling breath, raising bow, drawing, releasing, following through. Each movement had meaning. Each position required precise alignment of body and spirit. Tea ceremony, which had been refined by samurai patrons during earlier centuries, became a cultural practice accessible to anyone willing to study. Schools teaching different lineages of tea practice proliferated. Middle-class families sent daughters to study tea ceremony as part of refined education. The tea room became a space where modern Japanese could experience traditional aesthetics, where the frantic pace of modernization could be temporarily suspended in favor of mindful attention to simple actions. Calligraphy, flower arrangement, poetry composition, all the cultural practices that samurai had cultivated were now taught to ordinary citizens. What had been class privileges became cultural heritage, preserved through democratization. This had ironic effects. More people practiced these arts than ever before, but the depth of practice sometimes suffered. Mass education spread knowledge but diluted mastery. The preservation of physical artifacts required conscious effort. Castles, temples, shrines, traditional buildings, these were vulnerable to modernization's relentless drive. Some were demolished to make way for Western-style structures. Others fell into disrepair as their traditional uses vanished. But some were recognized as cultural treasures, preserved as monuments to the past, maintained as reminders of where Japan had come from. Museums were established to house samurai armor, swords, paintings, scrolls, all the material culture of the warrior class. These items, which had been personal possessions with deep family significance, became public heritage. A sword that had been passed father to son for generations might end up in a museum display case, admired by strangers, its history reduced to a placard. This preserved the object but changed its meaning fundamentally. The most complex preservation effort centered on Bushido itself. The term way of the warrior had been used informally for centuries, but it became a formal concept during the Meiji period, when intellectuals and former samurai attempted to articulate what warrior culture had meant. The most influential work was Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1900 by Nitobe Inazo, written in English for Western audiences. Nitobe presented Bushido as Japan's ethical system, comparable to Christianity in the West. He described samurai virtues, loyalty, honor, courage, self-discipline, benevolence, as the core of Japanese character. His book was elegant, persuasive, and significantly idealized. He presented samurai culture as more unified and consistent than it had ever actually been, smoothing over contradictions, emphasizing noble aspects while minimizing violence and cruelty. This idealized Bushido became tremendously influential, both in Japan and abroad. It provided a framework for understanding Japanese behavior, a cultural identity that seemed distinctive and admirable. It allowed modern Japanese to feel connected to their samurai past through shared values rather than class membership, but it also created mythology that obscured historical reality. The danger of this idealized Bushido became apparent in the early 20th century, as Japan pursued imperial expansion. The same values that could inspire dedication to duty and self-sacrifice could also justify militaristic aggression and unquestioning obedience to authority. Loyalty became loyalty to the emperor's divine will. Honor became honor through military service. Courage became willingness to die for national expansion. During the wars of the early 20th century, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and later the catastrophic Pacific War, Bushido rhetoric intensified. Soldiers were told they embodied samurai spirit, that death in battle was the highest honor, that surrender was unthinkable shame. The aesthetic appreciation of death, seeing cherry blossoms fall and contemplating mortality, became militarized propaganda about beautiful death for the emperor. Kamikaze pilots in World War II were presented as modern samurai, sacrificing themselves for lord and nation. The reality was more complex. Many were young men conscripted into service, given little choice, facing psychological pressure to volunteer for suicide missions. But the rhetoric invoked samurai precedent. Warriors had always chosen death over dishonor. The 47 Ronin had sacrificed themselves for loyalty. Now these pilots were following the ancient way. After Japan's defeat in 1945, this militaristic interpretation of Bushido was thoroughly discredited. The Allied occupation authorities were suspicious of anything that seemed to promote Japanese nationalism or militarism. Martial arts were temporarily banned. Sword ownership was restricted. Public discussion of samurai values became problematic, tainted by association with wartime atrocities. Yet samurai culture survived even this crisis. In the post-war period, as Japan rebuilt and redefined itself, the warrior tradition was reinterpreted once again. The emphasis shifted away from martial prowess and unquestioning loyalty toward aesthetic refinement, self-cultivation, and ethical behavior. The samurai as artist-warrior, as someone who balanced violence with culture, force with beauty, became the preferred image. This post-war samurai ideal emphasized the cultural achievements: tea ceremony, calligraphy, poetry, garden design. It stressed the philosophical dimensions: Zen meditation, self-discipline, constant improvement. It presented the samurai as someone who happened to be a warrior, but was defined more by ethical cultivation than by combat skill. This was selective memory, certainly, but it allowed connection to samurai tradition without militaristic baggage. Business culture particularly embraced this reinterpretation. Executives studied Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings as business strategy guide, translating sword-fighting principles into corporate competition. The dedication and discipline of samurai training became models for employee development. Loyalty to lord became loyalty to company. The warrior's path became the salaryman's path, reimagined for the corporate battlefield. In schools, moral education continued to emphasize values derived from samurai tradition: respect for others, dedication to duty, perseverance in face of difficulty, but now framed as universal virtues rather than specifically martial ones. Students learned about historical samurai as exemplars of character, but the emphasis was on their moral choices rather than their combat skills. The preservation of traditional crafts became a national priority. The government designated certain practitioners as living national treasures: masters of sword-making, lacquerwork, pottery, textile dyeing, and other traditional arts. These individuals received stipends to continue their work, take students, pass on techniques that might otherwise disappear. It was explicit recognition that certain knowledge, once lost, could never be recovered. Sword polishing is perhaps the most remarkable of these preserved arts. A sword polisher, Togishi, spends years learning to bring out the beauty of a blade, revealing the grain pattern in the steel, the transition line between hard edge and soft spine, the distinctive characteristics that identify the smith who created it. This is not sharpening that is a different skill, but aesthetic revelation. A Togishi works with increasingly fine stones, sometimes spending weeks on a single blade, approaching the work as meditation. Watch a master polisher at work, and you witness something almost sacred: absolute focus, minute adjustments, sensitivity to metal that seems supernatural. The polisher reads the blade through touch and sight, understanding its structure, responding to its individual character. This is craft elevated to art, labor transformed into spiritual practice. It embodies everything that samurai culture valued: dedication, patience, pursuit of perfection, respect for tradition, aesthetic sensitivity. Similar dedication characterizes other preserved crafts. Armor makers still create full suits of samurai armor using traditional techniques, though now for collectors and museums rather than battle. Bow makers craft yumi from laminated bamboo and wood, maintaining methods unchanged for centuries. Kimono weavers produce silk textiles of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Each of these crafts preserves not just techniques but entire worldviews, ways of understanding the relationship between maker and material, tradition and innovation. The question that runs through all these preservation efforts is, what are we preserving and why? Is it the techniques themselves, the specific methods for folding steel, mixing lacquer, arranging flowers? Or is it something deeper, a way of approaching work, a standard of excellence, a connection to past generations? Both answers are valid, but they lead to different practices and different outcomes. Some argue for strict historical accuracy, preserve exactly what was done, change nothing, maintain pure lineages. This approach values authenticity above all, seeing any innovation as corruption. But it can lead to ossification, turning living traditions into museum pieces, beautiful but dead. Others advocate adaptation, preserve the spirit but evolve the forms, let traditions grow and change while maintaining connection to their roots. This approach keeps traditions alive and relevant but risks losing what made them distinctive, diluting them beyond recognition. Most preservation efforts navigate between these extremes. A kendo practitioner uses modern training facilities, but bows in the same way samurai did. A calligrapher experiments with abstract expression while respecting classical forms. A tea master might incorporate contemporary ceramics into traditional ceremony. These compromises are imperfect, sometimes contradictory, but they keep traditions living rather than embalmed. What is clear is that samurai culture did not die when the samurai class was abolished. It transformed, dispersed, took root in new contexts. The values it embodied, discipline, loyalty, aesthetic refinement, and dedication to mastery, found new expressions. The practices it developed, martial arts, tea ceremony, meditation, became cultural heritage available to all. The spirit, whatever that means precisely, was preserved through this very process of transformation. Walk through Japan today, and you encounter samurai legacy everywhere, though often invisibly. In the emphasis on group harmony over individual assertion, in the dedication to craft and quality, in the aesthetic of simplicity and natural materials, in the martial arts practiced in neighborhood dojos, in the tea ceremony performed in cultural centers, in the carefully tended gardens that evoke natural landscapes through minimal means. The samurai themselves are gone. The last person with lived memory of samurai society died long ago, but what they created, what they valued, what they practiced, what they passed on persists. Not unchanged, certainly. Not pure, if purity ever existed, but present, woven into the fabric of modern Japanese culture, influencing behavior and values in ways both obvious and subtle. This is how cultures survive, not by freezing themselves in time, but by adapting while maintaining connection to their roots. Not by rejecting change, but by absorbing it and transforming it into something consistent with their deepest values. The samurai understood impermanence. Cherry blossoms fall, warriors die, nothing lasts forever. But they also understood that through careful attention, through dedication to excellence, through passing knowledge to the next generation, something essential persists even as forms change. The preservation of spirit in new forms, this is perhaps the most samurai achievement of all. Recognizing when the old forms must die and having the courage to let them go, while ensuring that what mattered most survives the transformation. There is a garden in Kyoto that has remained essentially unchanged for 500 years. Ryoan-ji, the Temple of the Peaceful Dragon, contains perhaps the most famous rock garden in Japan. 15 stones arranged on a bed of white gravel, surrounded by earthen walls. Sit on the viewing platform, and no matter where you position yourself, one stone is always hidden from view. The garden is complete only in imagination, never in direct perception. This garden, created during the height of samurai culture, embodies something profound about how traditions persist. Not through perfect preservation, the gravel is raked fresh each day, the stones weather and shift minutely over centuries, the surrounding trees grow and die and are replaced. Yet the essential pattern remains. The garden is both permanent and impermanent, fixed and flowing, ancient and renewed each morning. So it is with samurai culture in the modern world. The historical samurai, those warriors who lived and fought and died in feudal Japan, are as vanished as any ancient civilization. We cannot recover their lived experience, cannot truly know what it felt like to be them. But something persists, patterns of thought, ways of being, values and practices that continue to shape behavior and consciousness. The garden remains, though the stones have weathered. Consider a martial arts dojo anywhere in the world today. Students bow when entering. They line up by rank. They practice forms that were developed centuries ago, movements originally designed for combat with swords that most practitioners will never hold in earnest. The sensei teacher demonstrates a technique, and students repeat it, until muscle memory forms. Beneath the physical practice runs philosophical teaching. Discipline, respect, perseverance, the integration of mind and body. What is happening here? Are these practitioners connecting authentically to samurai tradition, or are they engaging in sophisticated historical reenactment? The answer is not simple. They are not samurai. They live in a completely different world, with different challenges, different opportunities, different threats. But they are accessing something real, practices that, when performed with dedication and proper understanding, can produce genuine transformation in the practitioner. The Japanese concept of kata form is key to understanding this. A kata is a prescribed sequence of movements, whether in martial arts, tea ceremony, calligraphy, or any traditional practice. To the untrained eye, kata might seem mechanical, repetitive, stifling of creativity, but practitioners know differently. Within the form, through the form, one discovers freedom. By repeating the same movements thousands of times, the conscious mind releases its grip and something deeper emerges. The body knows, the action flows. This is not mysticism but neuroscience. Repeated practice creates neural pathways, allowing complex actions to become automatic. But it is also psychology. The kata provides structure that frees attention for subtler dimensions of experience. And it is philosophy. Form and freedom are not opposites but complementary aspects of mastery. Modern practitioners of traditional arts are maintaining this understanding. A calligrapher practices the 8 basic strokes endlessly, each one requiring precise brush angle, pressure, speed. A beginner sees only restriction: why must it be exactly this way? But an experienced calligrapher discovers infinite variation within the form, finds personal expression through rather than against the tradition. The form is not a cage but a path, not a limitation but a liberation. This paradox that constraint enables creativity, that tradition provides the foundation for innovation, is deeply samurai. The warriors who created tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and other aesthetic practices understood that true mastery requires submission to tradition before transcending it. You cannot break the rules effectively until you have internalized them completely. Only by becoming the tradition can you authentically evolve beyond it. In contemporary Japan, this understanding pervades culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The attention to seasonal change, enjoying cherry blossoms in spring, maple leaves in autumn, first snow in winter, connects directly to samurai aesthetic sensitivity. The emphasis on doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, whether preparing food, wrapping a gift, or greeting a customer, reflects samurai dedication to excellence in all actions. The concept of shokunin kishitsu, craftsman's spirit that drives workers to perfect their skills regardless of recognition or reward, descends directly from samurai values. Japanese corporations, despite modern business practices, often retain structures and cultures that echo samurai relationships. The emphasis on long-term employment, the importance of harmony within the group, the expectation that senior members will mentor juniors, the practice of making decisions through consensus rather than individual authority, these patterns reflect warrior clan dynamics adapted to business context. This is not without problems. The same values that create cohesion and dedication can also produce conformity and suppress dissent. The loyalty that binds employees to companies can become exploitation when companies violate reciprocal obligations. The respect for hierarchy can stifle needed innovation. The emphasis on group harmony can silence important individual voices. Samurai values, like all values, are double-edged, but understanding the samurai roots of these patterns helps explain Japanese social dynamics. When a Japanese business person stays with a struggling company out of loyalty rather than seeking better opportunities elsewhere, this is not mere irrationality. It reflects values centuries old, the idea that obligations transcend individual benefit. When a craftsperson continues perfecting techniques in an economically dying industry, this connects to the samurai understanding that dedication to one's path matters regardless of worldly success. Beyond Japan, samurai culture has achieved remarkable global influence. Millions of people worldwide practice Japanese martial arts. They may live in Sao Paulo, Stockholm, or Sydney, but when they enter the dojo, they engage with practices developed in feudal Japan. They learn Japanese terminology, bow to portraits of founders, absorb philosophical teachings translated across vast cultural distances. This global spread raises fascinating questions about cultural transmission. Can someone with no Japanese heritage or cultural background authentically practice a Japanese martial art? Or is such practice inevitably appropriation, taking surface forms without underlying substance? The answer depends on depth of engagement. Someone who studies Aikido for years, learning not just techniques but philosophy, investigating the historical context, approaching practice with dedication and respect, this person is engaging authentically with the tradition, even if they do so from outside Japanese culture. They are not becoming Japanese, but they are accessing something real within the tradition. Conversely, someone who studies superficially, taking techniques without philosophy, practicing without dedication, treating the art as merely physical exercise or exotic entertainment, this person, regardless of their heritage, is not truly engaging with the tradition. They are performing a simulation, however technically proficient. The criterion is not ethnicity, but commitment. Samurai culture, like all profound traditions, reveals itself only to those willing to invest time, energy, and deep attention. It protects itself through difficulty, through years of repetitive practice, through teachings that seem paradoxical, through masters who demand complete dedication. Those unwilling to pay this price gain only surface understanding. Western fascination with samurai began in the 19th century and has never fully subsided. The image of the samurai disciplined warrior artist, living by a strict code, balancing violence with culture, appeals to something deep in the human imagination. Films, novels, video games, and anime have spread samurai imagery worldwide. A child in Mexico City might grow up with samurai as cultural reference points, seeing them as symbols of honor, discipline, and martial excellence. This popular image is highly selective and often inaccurate. The samurai of fiction are usually idealized, their less appealing characteristics downplayed or omitted. Historical samurai were sometimes brutal, often politically calculating, and not always governed by noble principles. But the idealized image persists because it represents something people want: a clear, ethical code, a path to excellence, integration of multiple dimensions of human capability. Business executives worldwide have embraced samurai philosophy, particularly through texts like Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings. They find in these writings strategies applicable to corporate competition, insights about timing and positioning, wisdom about preparation and adaptability. That these texts were written for sword combat does not diminish their applicability to other competitive domains. The principles understand your opponent, know yourself, adapt to circumstances, prepare thoroughly, act decisively, translate across contexts. But this application requires care. Business is not warfare, and pretending otherwise can justify behaviors that should be unacceptable. Competitiveness is valuable, but so is cooperation. Individual excellence matters, but so does social responsibility. The samurai way, valuable as it is, must be tempered by other values, integrated into a broader ethical framework that recognizes the complexity of modern life. The aesthetic dimensions of samurai culture may be their most enduring contribution. The tea ceremony continues to be practiced, preserving a space for mindfulness and aesthetic appreciation in frenetic modern life. The emphasis on natural materials, simple forms, and subtle beauty influences contemporary design worldwide. Japanese gardens, inspired by those created for samurai patrons, appear in cities across the globe, offering contemplative spaces that embody traditional principles. Architecture has been particularly influenced. The Japanese aesthetic clean lines, integration with nature, attention to materials, spaces that flow into each other shapes modern design thinking. Architects worldwide reference traditional Japanese buildings, adapting principles of simplicity, functionality, and beauty to contemporary needs. This is samurai culture transformed into spatial practice, warrior aesthetics serving peaceful purposes. The very concept of mindfulness, now ubiquitous in wellness culture, business training, and therapeutic practice, owes much to samurai-era developments in Zen practice. The idea that you can cultivate mental clarity and focus through specific practices, that meditation develops practical capacities as well as spiritual insight, that mind and body are integrated rather than separate, these understandings, refined by samurai working with Zen teachers, now circulate globally as secular techniques. Contemporary martial artists often pursue their practice not for combat capability, most will never face violent conflict, but for personal development. They seek discipline, confidence, physical fitness, mental clarity, and community. The martial aspects remain important, providing concrete challenges and measurable progress, but the deeper value lies in character development. This is entirely consistent with how later period samurai understood their own martial training, as cultivation of self rather than merely preparation for war. Some practitioners go deeper, studying not just techniques but history, philosophy, cultural context. They learn Japanese, read classical texts in original language, travel to Japan to train at historical dojos. They approach their practice as scholarly as well as physical, seeking to understand the tradition from within. These practitioners become bridges, transmitting knowledge across cultural boundaries while respecting its origins. The preservation of traditional crafts continues in Japan through dedicated practitioners, but also through institutions that support them. Museums display historical armor, swords, and artwork, making accessible to the public what once belonged to individual families. Universities research and document traditional techniques. Government programs provide funding for craftspeople. Cultural centers offer classes in tea ceremony, calligraphy, and ikebana. This institutionalization preserves but also changes. A tea ceremony, performed in a modern cultural center for a class of students, is not the same as a tea gathering among samurai and their carefully chosen guests. The context matters enormously. What was once intimate and exclusive becomes public and educational. The form persists, but the meaning shifts. Yet perhaps this is inevitable. Cultures survive by adapting. The tea ceremony of the modern cultural center may lack the intensity of its historical antecedent, but it keeps the practice alive, passes knowledge to new generations, maintains continuity with the past. Perfect preservation is impossible. The choice is between evolution and extinction, and evolution, however imperfect, is the only path forward. The question, what should we preserve, admits no simple answer. Some argue for preserving everything, every technique, every tradition, every practice, regardless of contemporary relevance. Others advocate selectivity, preserve what serves present needs, let the rest become history. Both positions have merit and limitations. Total preservation is impossible. We lack resources to maintain everything, and living traditions require living contexts. But selective preservation is dangerous. We may discard things whose value we do not yet recognize and cannot yet appreciate. How do we decide what matters? The decision reveals our values, which are themselves products of particular historical moments and cultural positions. Perhaps the wisest approach is to preserve broadly, while recognizing that not everything preserved will thrive equally. Make knowledge available, document techniques, record oral histories, create archives, and let future generations discover what speaks to them. Some preserved traditions will flourish, finding new relevance and practitioners. Others will remain archived, available but dormant, waiting for moments when they might resonate again. The samurai themselves understood this. They preserved and honored their ancestors while adapting to their own times. They maintained traditions while creating new ones. They respected the past without being enslaved by it. This balance, honoring heritage while remaining responsive to present circumstances, is perhaps their most valuable legacy. As we look forward, what relevance does samurai culture have for challenges facing the 21st century? The world they inhabited is gone. The problems they faced, endless warfare, rigid hierarchy, isolation from broader world, are not our problems. Yet something in their approach to life remains valuable. The dedication to mastery, to doing whatever you do with full attention and commitment, counters contemporary fragmentation and superficiality. The integration of multiple dimensions of human capability, martial, artistic, intellectual, spiritual challenges, narrow specialization. The acceptance of impermanence and cultivation of equanimity offers resources for managing uncertainty and change. The emphasis on self-cultivation as lifelong practice provides framework for continuous development. These are not uniquely samurai virtues. Many traditions emphasize similar values, but the specific forms they took in samurai culture, the particular practices that embodied them, the detailed transmission methods that preserved them, these offer one rich set of resources for human flourishing. Not the only resources, certainly, not suitable for everyone, but valuable for those who connect with them. The danger, always, is romanticization. The samurai were not superhuman paragons. They were people, with all the limitations that entails. They created remarkable cultural achievements, but also participated in cruelty, oppression, and violence. Their society was hierarchical, often unjust, based on principles we now reject. We can learn from them without worshipping them, can take what is valuable while recognizing what is problematic. The work of cultural transmission continues. Somewhere right now, a teacher is demonstrating a sword kata to students who will practice it until their muscles remember. A calligrapher is grinding ink, preparing to write characters that connect through unbroken lineage to medieval scribes. A craftsperson is folding steel, creating a blade using techniques passed down through centuries. An archivist is cataloging documents that preserve knowledge for future generations. These individuals are maintaining the garden. They rake the gravel, clean the stones, repair the walls. They cannot prevent change. The garden today is not identical to the garden of 500 years ago, but through their attention and care, the essential pattern persists. The garden remains recognizable, continuous with its past while existing fully in the present. This is what it means to honor tradition, not to freeze it in time, but to keep it living, not to worship the past, but to learn from it, not to repeat blindly, but to understand deeply and then create something appropriate for this moment, in this place, for these people. The samurai are gone. The world they knew has vanished as completely as if it had never been. Yet they are present, in the practices that continue, in the values that persist, in the aesthetic sensibilities that shape perception, in the ethical principles that guide behavior. They are present in the garden that is raked anew each morning while maintaining its pattern of centuries. Stand in that garden at Ryoanji. Contemplate those 15 stones, arranged with such care that they seem both random and inevitable, both natural and artful. Remember that one stone is always hidden from view, that completion exists only in imagination. This is the samurai legacy, not perfect preservation but living transmission, not finished form but ongoing practice, not final answer but continuous question. The eternal garden is maintained not through stasis, but through daily renewal. Each generation receives the tradition, lives within it, adapts it, and passes it forward. The pattern persists, not despite change, but through it. This is how culture survives, how meaning transmits across centuries, how the dead continue speaking to the living. The samurai understood impermanence. They knew that everything falls, that nothing lasts, that even mountains weather to dust. But they also understood that through careful attention, through dedication to excellence, through passing knowledge to the next generation, patterns can persist even as forms change. The individual cherry blossom falls, but spring returns. The warrior dies, but the way continues. In the end, this is what samurai culture offers, not a recipe for living, but an example of how humans can create meaning through dedication to excellence, how consciousness can be cultivated through practice, how death can be faced with equanimity, how beauty and violence can be integrated into a complex whole, how tradition and innovation can dance together rather than opposing each other. The garden remains, the stones stand in their pattern, the gravel is raked smooth, ready for tomorrow's footsteps. The walls enclose but do not imprison. The view invites contemplation but offers no single interpretation. In this space of form and emptiness, tradition and openness, the eternal and the momentary meet. The way of the warrior continues, transformed but present, available to those who seek it with sincerity and dedication, not as museum artifact or historical curiosity, but as living practice, as path for cultivation, as resource for creating lives of meaning and purpose. The samurai are gone. The samurai endure. Both statements are true, and the contradiction is the point. The eternal garden of memory preserves the pattern while allowing growth. The stones remain, the moss accumulates, the seasons turn, and we, standing here now, participate in continuity that stretches behind us into history and ahead into futures we cannot imagine. This is tradition, not burden but gift, not cage but structure, not ending but beginning. The story concludes, the story continues, as all true stories must.